When we think of Rome, we often imagine marble palaces, mighty armies, and bustling marketplaces echoing with trade and chatter. But beneath the glittering facade of the Roman Empire lay a dark, brutal truth. Its foundation was built on the backs of millions of slaves. These men, women, and children were not merely background figures in Roman society, they were the engine that kept the empire running. Without them, Rome would have collapsed under its own weight. Yet their stories are often silenced, buried in the shadows of history. Slavery in Rome was not like the slavery of later centuries, it was even more vast and, in many ways, more terrifying. In the height of the empire, historians estimate that 1 in every 3 people in Italy was enslaved. Imagine walking through the crowded streets of Rome, every third face you saw was someone living without freedom, without rights, and often without hope. For the Roman elite, slaves were a sign of status. A wealthy senator might own hundreds. Some were forced into fields, toiling under the scorching sun from dawn till dusk. Others served in kitchens, scrubbing pots and preparing banquets they themselves would never taste. Some were chained to ships, rowing endlessly through storm and battle, their lives extinguished in service of Roman conquest. But the most horrific roles were reserved for those destined to be gladiators or public entertainment, human beings reduced to spectacles of blood and suffering for the crowds. The cruelty was written into the very laws of Rome. A master had absolute power over his slaves. He could whip them, brand them, sell them, or kill them without fear of consequence. To the Roman state, slaves were property, not people. And yet, paradoxically, the same system depended on their labor for everything: the roads, the aqueducts, the grand monuments we still marvel at today. Every stone of the Colosseum is a silent witness to hands that bled laying it in place. But this system of exploitation carried with it a constant undercurrent of fear. Rome was always haunted by the threat of revolt. And no uprising terrified the Roman elite more than the rebellion led by Spartacus in 73 BCE. Spartacus himself was a gladiator, a slave trained to fight and die for sport. Along with a band of fellow gladiators, he broke free from his captors and sparked one of the greatest slave revolts in history. What began as a small escape swelled into a full-scale rebellion. Tens of thousands of slaves and oppressed peasants joined Spartacus, burning estates and defeating Roman legions sent against them. For a moment, it seemed as though the slaves might overturn the empire itself. But Rome responded with brutal efficiency. After years of fighting, Spartacus was killed in battle. His followers, over 6,000 men, were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies left hanging on crosses for miles as a gruesome warning. The message was clear: resistance would be met with terror. Yet even in times of peace, the suffering was relentless. Roman households often separated children from their parents. Infants born into slavery could be sold at markets, their futures determined by the flick of an auctioneer's hand. Those who resisted their masters were branded with hot irons, permanently scarred so that their status as property could never be hidden. Others were forced into sexual slavery, subjected to the desires of their owners night after night. For these individuals, Rome's grandeur was nothing more than a prison gilded in marble. What makes this even more chilling is how normalized it was. Roman writers, philosophers, and politicians rarely questioned the morality of slavery. To them, it was simply the natural order of society. The philosopher Aristotle once claimed that some people were slaves by nature, destined only to serve. This belief was absorbed into Roman culture, justifying an empire of cruelty with intellectual arrogance. Even when slaves managed to buy their freedom, a rare and difficult feat, they were never truly free. Freedmen carried the stigma of their past, and their children often struggled to rise in a society that valued noble blood over hard-earned liberty. But not all stories were of despair. In hidden corners, slaves created their own small acts of resistance. Some practiced forbidden religions, whispering prayers to gods from their homelands. Others carved graffiti on walls, leaving behind messages of defiance and humanity. These fragments remind us that even in chains, the enslaved sought to hold on to dignity, culture, and identity. Their resistance was not always grand like Spartacus's revolt, sometimes it was as simple as surviving another day in the face of crushing oppression. And the truth is, Rome could never fully erase their presence. Archaeologists today uncover tombstones and household objects that reveal glimpses of their lives, a broken pot scratched with a slave's name, or a small child's toy buried beneath the ruins of a villa. These are voices that history tried to silence, but which still echo from the ground beneath Rome's fallen stones. The Roman elite, however, never saw themselves as villains. They believed their wealth and power justified their dominance. For them, slavery was not cruelty, it was civilization. They argued that by enslaving foreigners, they were bringing them into the grandeur of Roman culture, teaching them language, religion, and customs. But this so-called civilizing mission was nothing more than a mask for exploitation. Rome's glory was purchased with stolen lives. Perhaps the darkest irony of all is that Rome, the civilization that gave us the idea of republican government, of law, of order, built those very ideals on the denial of freedom for millions. When Roman senators gathered in their marble halls to debate liberty, equality, and the rights of citizens, they were surrounded by slaves serving their wine, cleaning their floors, and preparing their feasts. Liberty for the few was made possible only by the chains of the many. As we peel back the polished image of ancient Rome, we begin to see the empire not just as a beacon of civilization but as a machine of exploitation. And the question lingers, how many of the empire's achievements, how many of its monuments and victories, would have been possible without the lives consumed in silence? The slaves of Rome rarely appear in history's spotlight. Their names are missing from the great chronicles, their stories overshadowed by emperors and generals. Yet without them, Rome could not have risen, nor endured. Their suffering is the hidden cost of empire, the price paid for every marble column and golden triumph. And so, as we leave this chapter of Rome's dark side, we carry with us a haunting truth: beneath the grandeur of the empire, the heartbeat of Rome was not the drum of legions or the voice of emperors, it was the silent, unending labor of millions in chains. If Roman slavery was the silent backbone of the empire, then gladiators were its most brutal entertainment. They were the public face of Rome's cruelty, paraded before roaring crowds in arenas across the empire. Today, when we picture gladiators, we imagine heroes, muscular warriors, fighting with honor beneath the blazing sun of the Colosseum. But the reality was far darker, far more pitiless. To the Romans, gladiators were not heroes. They were expendable bodies, trained to die for sport. The Colosseum, completed in the year 80 CE, could hold more than 50,000 spectators. Imagine standing in that vast stone amphitheater as the gates creaked open and men shuffled into the arena, weapons in hand. These men were not volunteers seeking glory. Most were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war. Captured Gauls, Thracians, and Germans, defeated enemies of Rome, were dragged into training schools and transformed into gladiators. Others were condemned criminals, given no choice but to fight or be executed outright. To the Roman people, these men were less than human. Their purpose was to bleed, to suffer, and to die for the crowd's amusement. Gladiator schools, or ludi, were not glamorous training academies. They were prisons. Behind the stone walls, gladiators lived under constant surveillance, shackled at night to prevent escape. They ate a diet designed to build bulk, not strength, a gruel of barley, beans, and water. Archaeological studies of gladiator bones confirm this, showing high levels of plant ash in their remains. They were deliberately fattened, not for their health, but to ensure their wounds would look more dramatic when struck. A well-fed gladiator bled more spectacularly under the sun. Training was brutal. Men fought day after day against one another, beaten by their instructors if they faltered. Wooden swords were used at first, but punishment was merciless. If a trainee disobeyed or showed weakness, the lash awaited. Escape was nearly impossible. Guards patrolled the barracks constantly, and gladiators who tried to flee faced crucifixion if caught. These schools were factories of suffering, turning unwilling men into instruments of Roman entertainment. But the cruelty did not stop at training. In the arena, fights were rarely fair. Though popular culture imagines duels of skill and honor, most matches were carefully staged spectacles designed for maximum bloodshed. Gladiators were often pitted against stronger opponents, wild animals, or even entire groups. Some were sent into the arena unarmed, forced to fight with their bare hands. Others faced lions, bears, or elephants, released from cages to the delight of the crowd. The outcome was almost always certain, death. And yet, death itself was not always swift. Roman audiences demanded variety in their spectacles. A defeated gladiator could appeal for mercy by raising a finger. The crowd would then roar, calling for life or death. The final decision lay with the sponsor of the games, often an emperor or politician seeking public approval. With a simple gesture, a thumb turned up or down, a man's fate was sealed. If mercy was denied, the victor was expected to deliver a killing blow, sometimes slicing through the throat, other times plunging a blade into the chest. A fallen body was dragged across the sand, blood soaking into the ground as the crowd cheered. To the Romans, this was entertainment. To us, it is unthinkable. And yet, the Colosseum was filled day after day with spectators of every class. Senators and noblewomen sat in shaded seats, while peasants crammed into the upper tiers. Children watched as men were torn apart, learning early that Roman power was built on violence. For the elite, the games were not only entertainment but also propaganda. They reminded the people that Rome's might was absolute, that life and death lay in the hands of the empire. There were moments, however, when the illusion of control shattered. Gladiators, though brutalized, sometimes rose to fame. A few became celebrities, adored by the masses. Names like Spiculus, the favorite of Emperor Nero, were shouted by fans who followed their careers like modern sports stars. Women were known to swoon over gladiators, their sweat and blood seen as the ultimate symbols of virility. Some gladiators even had their likeness carved into lamps, cups, and graffiti, their images circulating like the trading cards of antiquity. But fame was a double-edged sword. The higher a gladiator rose, the more dangerous his life became. Victories brought temporary admiration, but they never erased the fact that he was still a slave. And in the end, almost all gladiators met the same fate, death in the arena. Very few survived long enough to earn their freedom. The average career lasted only a handful of years, and most died young. Perhaps the most disturbing truth about gladiators is that their suffering was not accidental, it was deliberate, woven into the fabric of Roman culture. The games were not about competition or skill, they were about power. Every drop of blood spilled on the sand was a reminder of Rome's dominance. The empire thrived on violence, and the arena was its beating heart. Some Romans did question the morality of the games. Philosophers like Seneca criticized the bloodlust of the crowd, describing executions where criminals were burned alive or torn apart for spectacle. The arena, he wrote, is where men learn to kill, and where men are taught to die. But his voice was drowned out by the roar of thousands, hungry for more. What makes this even more haunting is how the games were tied to politics. Emperors staged massive spectacles to win public favor, spending fortunes on blood and death. When citizens rioted over food shortages or corruption, a grand set of games could pacify them. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal wrote, were all that was needed to keep Rome under control, food for the belly, blood for the eyes. And so, the gladiator became the ultimate symbol of Rome's dark side, part prisoner, part performer, part sacrifice. The sand of the arena was soaked with the blood of thousands, each death feeding the empire's insatiable hunger for power and control. When we look at the ruins of the Colosseum today, it is easy to marvel at its architecture, its engineering brilliance. But we must remember what it truly was, a monument to cruelty. Beneath its arches echo not the cheers of glory, but the screams of men forced to die for amusement. Every stone is stained with their suffering, every shadow haunted by their ghosts. The gladiators were not heroes. They were victims of an empire that turned pain into entertainment. Their story is not one of glory, but of exploitation, a story that reveals just how far Rome was willing to go in pursuit of power and pleasure. If the gladiators were the blood spilled for Rome's spectacle, the emperors were the architects of its cruelty. Absolute power, left unchecked, often breeds madness, and in Rome, that madness was on full display. While history sometimes glamorizes the emperors as visionary leaders or military geniuses, the reality was far more sinister. Behind the marble palaces and towering columns lay a world of paranoia, sexual deviance, sadistic cruelty, and unchecked indulgence. Take Caligula, the so-called Little Boots, who rose to power in 37 CE. His reign, though brief, is infamous for its acts of cruelty and excess. Caligula reportedly declared himself a living god, ordering statues of himself erected in temples, even in places sacred to Jupiter. He forced senators to kiss his feet and publicly humiliated those who refused. Some ancient accounts suggest he would throw people into the Tiber River simply to amuse himself or have them executed on a whim. Caligula's reign was not merely tyrannical, it was theater, a grotesque display of absolute power run wild. Then there was Nero, remembered for his extravagance and cruelty. He is said to have played the lyre while Rome burned in 64 CE, though some historians debate this detail. Regardless, Nero's palace projects consumed enormous wealth while the city's poor suffered. He reportedly staged elaborate performances in which humans were executed as part of the spectacle. He reveled in humiliating his political enemies and even forced senators to participate in grotesque theatrical games. For Nero, life was a stage, and everyone else was merely a prop. Commodus, emperor a century later, took the notion of spectacle to its most terrifying extreme. Unlike the previous rulers who relied on proxies for entertainment, Commodus himself fought in the arena. He would enter the Colosseum dressed as Hercules, slaying beasts and gladiators alike, though opponents were often restrained to ensure his victory. While the crowd cheered, the moral rot of Rome deepened, an emperor who was both ruler and entertainer, blurring the line between governance and spectacle. The cruelty of these emperors was not limited to the arena or the palace. Many engaged in sexual deviance unchecked, exploiting both slaves and citizens. Caligula reportedly had incestuous relations within his family, while others forced citizens into humiliating sexual acts to assert dominance. Private orgies became a tool of political power, a way to control the elite by binding them in shame. Ancient Rome's moral boundaries were flexible, often bending to accommodate the whims of those in power. Paranoia ran as deeply as indulgence. Emperors lived in constant fear of assassination. Guards, spies, and informants prowled the halls, ready to report any perceived disloyalty. Plots against the throne were common, and the punishment for mere suspicion could be death. Senators were executed, families destroyed, and loyal friends betrayed. The palace became both a playground and a prison, where the line between life and death depended entirely on the emperor's mood. Interestingly, the sources we have, histories written by the elite, may exaggerate some of these tales. But the consistency of accounts from Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio paints a picture of rulers whose appetite for power knew no limits. Whether fully factual or colored by bias, these stories reveal how an unchecked emperor could inflict suffering on thousands, from political enemies to ordinary citizens. Yet the reigns of these emperors also reveal a paradox: their acts of cruelty were inseparable from their public image. Rome expected entertainment, spectacle, and dominance. The people cheered for emperors who could impose fear as well as awe. Their power was absolute because it was performative. An emperor who showed mercy too openly risked appearing weak. In a city that celebrated blood, cruelty was a tool for maintaining legitimacy. Beyond the scandals, these rulers also manipulated religion and tradition to cement control. They were deified during their lifetimes, forcing citizens to worship living gods. Temples were constructed in their honor, sacrifices offered, and rituals performed. Refusal was dangerous, sometimes deadly. Religion became not a spiritual matter but a mechanism of obedience, entwining faith and fear. Political intrigue was another form of entertainment. Emperors orchestrated purges, exiling or executing rivals and family members alike. Allegiances shifted overnight, alliances formed and crumbled, and every banquet, every meeting, held the potential for betrayal. In this environment, even the closest confidants could be spies. Loyalty was temporary, and suspicion was constant. Those who survived did so by navigating a web of fear and deception, their fates resting on nothing more than fortune or cunning. Despite the terror, these emperors were not invincible. Many met violent ends, assassinated by conspirators, guards, or even their own families. Yet their legacies endure, haunting Rome long after their deaths. Their reigns serve as stark reminders that power, when divorced from accountability, can descend into chaos and cruelty. By examining these emperors, we see the human cost of unchecked authority. The lives lost, the families torn apart, the fear instilled in entire populations, it was all part of a system designed to consolidate power. Their stories challenged the notion of Rome as a civilized empire. Behind the grandeur and sophistication was a darker truth, a society where terror, spectacle, and indulgence were inseparable from leadership. The lesson of these emperors is clear. Absolute power does not merely corrupt, it distorts reality itself. It reshapes morality, manipulates culture, and prioritizes spectacle over justice. The stories of Caligula, Nero, and Commodus remind us that Rome's outward splendor rested on inner decay, that the shining marble facades of palaces concealed cruelty, paranoia, and moral collapse. As we leave the palaces and enter the streets of Rome, it becomes evident that the emperor's indulgences did not exist in isolation. The corruption of leadership trickled down, affecting politics, society, and the everyday lives of ordinary Romans. To understand Rome's darkness, we must now turn from the rulers to the society that allowed such excesses to flourish, from absolute power to systemic corruption. While emperors wielded absolute power from their palaces, the decay of Rome's moral and social structure spread far beyond their marble walls. The rot was systemic, infecting every layer of society, from senators and magistrates to merchants and ordinary citizens. Beneath the grandeur of temples and triumphal arches, the everyday reality for most Romans was one of corruption, exploitation, and despair. Rome's political system, which in theory celebrated the virtues of the Republic, had long been hollowed out by greed. Senators, who were supposed to serve the state, often treated their offices as opportunities for personal enrichment. Bribes and favors flowed like wine at a banquet. Judges were bought, laws twisted, and justice reserved for those who could afford it. A wealthy citizen could escape punishment for murder, theft, or fraud, while the poor faced the lash or the cross. The scales of justice, emblematic of Roman law, were tipped heavily in favor of the elite. The corruption extended into everyday life. Grain shortages, which could mean starvation for the urban poor, were often manipulated by officials for profit. Some senators hoarded supplies, selling grain at inflated prices to enrich themselves while citizens starved. Riots over food were common, often brutally suppressed. Soldiers were called to quell uprisings in the streets, wielding swords not against Rome's enemies but against its own citizens. The population, once the foundation of the empire's strength, was treated as expendable. Rome's wealth, vast and dazzling, was concentrated in the hands of a few. Patrician families lived in opulent villas, their walls adorned with frescoes depicting mythological victories. Their banquets featured exotic dishes, peacock tongues, dormice stuffed with spices, and oysters imported from distant provinces. Meanwhile, the plebeians, the majority of the population, lived in cramped insulae, multi-story tenements with little light, no running water, and rampant disease. Fire was a constant threat, as poorly constructed buildings could collapse or burn, and city officials were either incapable or unwilling to enforce safety regulations. Debt was another weapon used against the poor. Citizens who fell behind on taxes or loans could find themselves enslaved, their children sold, or their property confiscated. The cycle of poverty was nearly impossible to escape. Wealth and privilege became a self-perpetuating system, where the elite profited from the suffering of the masses. The very institutions meant to protect citizens instead reinforced inequality, creating a society divided not just by class but by access to life itself. Yet corruption was not merely financial, it was cultural. Roman society celebrated cunning and manipulation as virtues when exercised by the powerful. Orators, magistrates, and senators who excelled at scheming and bribery were admired, while honesty was often seen as weakness. Wealthy families cultivated influence through marriage alliances, patronage networks, and favors, consolidating power across generations. Merit and morality were secondary to strategy and exploitation. Religion, too, was not immune. Temples and priesthoods often became conduits for wealth and influence rather than spiritual guidance. Festivals and sacrifices, ostensibly for the gods, were opportunities to display opulence, attract followers, and intimidate rivals. Corruption and greed permeated even the sacred spaces, illustrating that Rome's decay extended beyond the secular sphere into the spiritual. The consequences of this systemic corruption were devastating. Public infrastructure, while grand in appearance, was often mismanaged. Roads crumbled, aqueducts leaked, and sewage systems overflowed. Disease spread quickly through crowded cities, and mortality rates remained high. Public order required constant military presence, a testament to the fragility of social stability. Rome's empire, though mighty in conquest, was fragile at home. The cracks were hidden beneath layers of gold and marble, but they were widening, threatening the very foundation of civilization. Yet the Romans themselves often seemed oblivious or resigned. Many citizens accepted corruption as inevitable, a necessary evil in a city as vast and complex as Rome. They cheered for the gladiators, attended extravagant festivals, and looked the other way as officials enriched themselves. Bread and circuses distracted the masses, keeping them entertained even as their liberties eroded. This complacency, fueled by spectacle and indulgence, allowed corruption to thrive unchecked. But corruption was not just a product of the elite, it was also a reflection of human nature magnified by the structures of power. Rome, in its grandeur, created the perfect conditions for greed to flourish. Ambition and desire, left unchecked, turned the Senate into a stage for manipulation, turned ordinary citizens into pawns, and turned justice into a commodity. Every act of corruption reinforced the system, making it more difficult to reform. Even in private life, morality was a luxury few could afford. The wealthy engaged in theft, fraud, and bribery to maintain their status. Ordinary Romans cheated landlords, evaded taxes, and conspired in small-scale schemes to survive. Society normalized deceit at every level, and trust became a rare commodity. In a city built on appearances, the gap between perception and reality was enormous, and the empire's true state was masked by pageantry and propaganda. This pervasive corruption set the stage for further decay. It allowed excess and indulgence to flourish, creating fertile ground for moral and social collapse. The elite's pursuit of pleasure, combined with systemic exploitation, transformed Rome from a republic with ideals into an empire fueled by greed and fear. And while the emperors wielded power at the top, it was the culture of corruption that ensured that cruelty, exploitation, and decadence touched every aspect of Roman life. As we leave the streets, villas, and courts of Rome, we begin to understand the depth of its societal rot. The empire's grandeur was not merely the product of military conquest or architectural brilliance, it was built on systemic corruption, the exploitation of the vulnerable, and the complicity of those who looked the other way. And yet, even as society decayed, darker forces lurked in the shadows, feeding on superstition, indulgence, and fear. Beneath the grandeur of temples and the bustling streets of Rome, there existed a hidden world that few dared to speak about, a world of secret cults, forbidden rituals, and deep-seated superstition. While the empire prided itself on law, reason, and order, the spiritual undercurrents of Roman life were often chaotic, even terrifying. These were rituals performed in shadowed rooms, festivals that teetered on the edge of violence, and beliefs that could condemn a neighbor, or even a stranger, to death. The most notorious of these underground practices was the Bacchanalia, the festival of Bacchus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and chaos. Celebrated in secret, often at night and in remote locations, the Bacchanalia were not merely feasts, they were alleged to be wild, orgiastic rites involving drinking, dancing, and unrestrained sexual behavior. Accounts by Roman senators and historians suggest that these gatherings spiraled into criminality, with murder, theft, and human sacrifice rumored to occur. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate banned the Bacchanalia after rumors spread that conspiracies were being hatched under the cover of celebration. The punishment was severe, participants were executed or imprisoned, highlighting the fear these cults instilled in the establishment. But the Bacchanalia were only the tip of the iceberg. Mystery cults from across the empire found a home in Rome, offering forbidden knowledge and secret rites. The cult of Isis from Egypt, for example, promised eternal life and divine protection, but required secrecy and obedience to arcane rituals. Initiates swore oaths and participated in ceremonies that outsiders could not witness. Though outwardly religious, these cults were often viewed with suspicion, feared for their power to manipulate loyalty and inspire rebellion. The Roman elite, ever wary of threats to their authority, monitored them closely. Magic and superstition were everywhere. Romans believed in curses and charms, often inscribed on small lead tablets and buried under doorways or graves. These depictions were intended to harm enemies, control love affairs, or influence the outcome of business and politics. Archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of such tablets, each a haunting testament to the fear, desperation, and cunning of ordinary Romans. In a society governed by power and spectacle, the supernatural offered a sense of control, however tenuous, over an unpredictable world. Human sacrifice, though rare, was not unheard of in Rome. While mainstream religion officially condemned such acts, secretive practices sometimes crossed moral boundaries. Captives, criminals, and even slaves could be offered to appease angry gods during times of crisis, such as plague or famine. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and burial sites, suggests that these acts were intended to protect the city or curry favor with the divine. To those participating, it was an act of piety; to those outside, it was horrifying. Early Christians, who were often misunderstood and feared, were frequently accused of partaking in dark rites. Misinterpretations of their rituals, such as the Eucharist, led to rumors of cannibalism and secret conspiracies. These accusations fueled persecution and martyrdom, turning religious devotion into a death sentence for many. The fear of secret religious practices was so intense that it could topple reputations and incite violent crackdowns, demonstrating how superstition and misunderstanding could become tools of oppression. Omens, auguries, and prophecies dominated everyday life. The flight patterns of birds, the appearance of comets, and the entrails of sacrificed animals were all analyzed for hidden meaning. Decisions of war, marriage, and political appointments were often influenced by these interpretations. For Roman leaders, ignoring omens was not merely risky, it was considered sacrilegious. The intersection of superstition and politics created a culture where fear of the unseen dictated actions, sometimes with deadly consequences. The dark undercurrents of Roman religion extended even into private life. Families kept household gods, or lares, for protection, but they also consulted soothsayers and magicians for guidance. In a world of uncertainty, the line between superstition and desperation blurred. A neighbor's success might be attributed to magic, prompting envy and curses; a sudden illness could be blamed on malevolent forces. Life was a constant negotiation with the unseen, a dance between fear and faith. Roman law attempted to regulate these practices, but enforcement was inconsistent. Participation in banned cults could result in death or exile, yet ordinary citizens continued rituals in secret, often hidden from authorities. The very secrecy of these acts gave them a dangerous allure, attracting individuals seeking power, knowledge, or protection beyond what the empire could provide. In many ways, the clandestine spiritual world of Rome was a mirror of its political one, hidden, perilous, and governed by fear. What makes this aspect of Roman life especially compelling, and terrifying, is how it reveals the empire's contradictions. Rome prided itself on reason, civic duty, and order, yet beneath the surface, people lived in fear of curses, divine retribution, and secret societies. The tension between public virtue and private superstition created a city where morality was fluid, fear was omnipresent, and survival often depended on navigating the invisible forces around you. Ultimately, the secret cults and superstitions of Rome illuminate a society obsessed with control, obsessed with power, and obsessed with appearances. The rituals were not merely spiritual, they were social and political, reflecting the anxieties of a population constantly navigating violence, oppression, and hierarchy. The empire's strength, after all, relied not only on armies and laws but also on the careful management of belief, fear, and obedience. As we step away from the shadowed temples and hidden rituals, the lesson is clear: Roman life was never as simple as it appeared. Beneath the public face of civic pride and military might existed a labyrinth of superstition, secret societies, and dark rites. These hidden practices, often terrifying in nature, remind us that the empire's power was not only physical or political, it was psychological, rooted in the manipulation of fear, belief, and secrecy. Rome was a city of extremes. Its architecture reached for the heavens, its armies conquered distant lands, and its festivals dazzled the senses. But alongside this grandeur lay a fascination far more sinister: the spectacle of death. Public executions were not merely judicial acts, they were performances, carefully choreographed for the entertainment of the masses. In Rome, violence was a form of theater, a stage upon which power, fear, and brutality converged. The arenas of Rome, from the Colosseum to smaller amphitheaters scattered across the empire, were theaters of terror. Spectators cheered not for victory or heroism, but for suffering. Executions were elaborate, designed to maximize shock and drama. Criminals, slaves, and captives of war were often paraded through the streets before being thrown into arenas, their fates known only to the magistrates and the emperor. The anticipation itself became a spectacle, feeding the crowd's appetite for blood. Some executions were unimaginably cruel. Crucifixion, a method reserved for slaves and traitors, involved prolonged agony. Victims were nailed to wooden crosses, left to die slowly under the scorching sun. Others were burned alive, sometimes dressed in animal skins to mimic beasts, blending punishment with grotesque theater. These deaths were publicized, announced in advance, and attended by thousands who cheered, jeered, or simply watched in morbid fascination. But execution was not the only spectacle. Exotic animal hunts, known as venations, captivated the Roman imagination. Lions, tigers, bears, and even elephants were imported from Africa and the East, starved and provoked to attack human combatants. Gladiators, or occasionally condemned criminals, faced these beasts, often unarmed, and their deaths were a form of entertainment. The roar of the animals and the screams of the victims filled the amphitheater, leaving spectators simultaneously thrilled and horrified. The spectacle was a brutal affirmation of Roman dominance over both man and nature. Rome's obsession with death extended beyond the arenas into festivals and public events. Executions were synchronized with religious holidays, triumphs, and political celebrations, ensuring maximum impact. The populace was conditioned to accept violence as both spectacle and moral lesson. Watching the suffering of others became entertainment, and desensitization was complete. Children, raised on the spectacle of crucifixions and beast hunts, learned early that life could be cheap, and cruelty could be celebrated. These spectacles also served a political purpose. Emperors and magistrates used executions and public violence to demonstrate their authority. They reminded citizens that rebellion, crime, or dissent would be met with uncompromising punishment. Bread and circuses were not only about appeasement, they were instruments of control. The thrill of witnessing death masked the fear it instilled, a subtle but effective reinforcement of Roman power. Some executions were ingeniously macabre. Historical accounts describe criminals sewn into animal skins and tossed into the arena to be devoured by wild beasts, creating a nightmarish fusion of punishment and performance. Others were forced into combat against multiple opponents, ensuring a drawn-out, bloody demise. These events were carefully orchestrated to elicit the maximum emotional response from the audience: shock, fear, and awe. In the eyes of the Romans, this was entertainment, but to us, it is horror writ large. The role of the spectators cannot be overlooked. Attendance was universal, cutting across class lines. Nobles, merchants, and laborers alike crowded into amphitheaters, sharing the same fascination with pain and spectacle. Some cheered with zeal, others observed silently, while some participated in bets, wagering on who would survive, who would fall, or how quickly the beasts would strike. This collective fascination with death was both social and psychological, reinforcing the city's norms and values in the most visceral way imaginable. Interestingly, not all were forced into the arena. Volunteers occasionally fought in these deadly games, lured by fame, debt repayment, or the promise of freedom. But even their agency was illusory. The games were deadly by design, and the majority did not survive long enough to claim any reward. Those who became popular or victorious often found themselves bound to more matches, extending the cycle of danger rather than escaping it. Triumph and peril were inseparable. Historians also suggest that these spectacles were a reflection of Rome's collective psyche. The empire was vast and powerful, yet built on conquest, slavery, and fear. Watching others suffer allowed citizens to internalize the reality of power. Control requires both awe and terror. The arena mirrored the empire itself, a world in which life and death were instruments of authority. By the time the sun set over the Colosseum, the sand soaked with blood and the roar of the crowd faded into history, one thing was clear: Rome had transformed death into art. Every execution, every hunt, every spectacle was a calculated demonstration of power, a macabre performance that left the spectators entertained, terrified, and complicit. These spectacles of death reveal a society where cruelty was normalized, where morality was subordinate to amusement, and where the suffering of others was a cornerstone of culture. They remind us that the Roman Empire, for all its achievements, was as fascinated with annihilation as it was with construction, as enthralled by chaos as it was by law. And as we leave the arenas behind, the echoes of screams remind us that the darkest corners of Roman civilization were public, celebrated, and terrifyingly ordinary. Rome was a city of extremes, where public morality and private indulgence often existed in stark contrast. Beneath the veneer of political debate, military conquest, and religious ceremony, there existed a hidden world of sexual intrigue, exploitation, and taboo pleasures, a shadow society that thrived in the empire's darkest corners. This was a world rarely spoken of in official records but hinted at in graffiti, frescoes, and the scandalous accounts of contemporary writers. The sexual underground of Rome was complex and omnipresent. Brothels, or lupanaria, dotted the city's streets, particularly near the Forum and along the Subura. These establishments were not merely commercial enterprises, they were hubs of exploitation. Slaves, both men and women, were forced into sexual labor, serving clients from all social classes. Children were not exempt. Some were born into slavery and sold into brothels, their innocence stolen to satisfy the appetites of the powerful. The law offered little protection, slaves were property first and human beings second. Yet the sexual culture of Rome extended beyond the streets. Wealthy citizens engaged in private indulgence, hosting secret parties where taboos were broken and morality blurred. Ancient writers describe extravagant gatherings with orgiastic rites, where social status dictated access to forbidden pleasures. Women and men alike were entangled in webs of power, coercion, and desire. Participation was often a means of survival or advancement, forcing individuals into compromising acts. In such a society, pleasure and exploitation were inseparable. Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash, offers a rare glimpse into this hidden world. Frescoes in private homes depict explicit sexual acts, ranging from heterosexual encounters to same-sex relations. These images were not considered shameful within the household, they were a private reflection of desires and fantasies that would have been scandalous in public. Graffiti scrawled on walls adds another layer. Crude jokes, sexual boasts, and commentary on local prostitutes reveal a society fascinated, and sometimes obsessed, with sex. Power dynamics were central to Rome's sexual underground. Emperors and elite men often exploited their position, coercing slaves, servants, or even citizens into sexual acts. Ancient texts hint at political manipulation through sexual favor, blackmail, or forced intimacy. The line between consent and coercion was frequently erased. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of these abuses. Marriage could be a tool of control rather than affection, and wives of the elite were expected to navigate both political and sexual demands with discretion, or risk ruin. Same-sex relationships were part of Roman sexual life but were governed by strict social codes. Men could engage in sexual activity with other men without losing status, but only if they were the dominant partner. Those who assumed a submissive role faced social shame and potential punishment. For women, the social consequences of sexual transgression were far more severe. Honor, chastity, and family reputation dictated behavior, yet these standards coexisted with widespread exploitation and the flourishing of private vice. Prostitution, too, was normalized yet stigmatized. Brothel workers were marginalized yet essential to Rome's social economy. Clients spanned the spectrum of society, from laborers to senators, illustrating the pervasive demand. Slaves in these roles had no recourse, escape was difficult, and their owners profited from every transaction. Some elite citizens even maintained private brothels within their villas, blending wealth, power, and sexual exploitation into a hidden economy. The sexual underground was further complicated by ritual and superstition. Certain cults incorporated sexual rites, promising divine favor, fertility, or personal empowerment. The line between religious devotion and indulgent excess blurred, and accusations of scandal often followed. For example, the Bacchanalia, already infamous for their orgiastic nature, were seen by authorities as dangerous precisely because they combined secret sexuality with spiritual practice. Despite the oppression and exploitation, there were subtle forms of resistance. Some individuals navigated the underground for personal autonomy, using sexuality as a means of influence, escape, or negotiation. Freed slaves, entertainers, and prostitutes occasionally carved out niches of power, leveraging the very desires imposed upon them by society. These acts, though limited, were small assertions of agency in an otherwise brutal and coercive system. The sexual underground was inseparable from Rome's broader culture of spectacle, corruption, and power. Pleasure, coercion, fear, and secrecy intertwined, reflecting the empire's moral complexity. In a society obsessed with appearances, public virtue often masked private vice, and those in power exploited both. Sex was not merely private indulgence, it was a tool, a weapon, and a currency in the empire's hidden networks. By examining this underground, we gain a fuller understanding of Roman society. It was a civilization capable of remarkable achievements in art, engineering, and governance, yet it was also deeply flawed. Its greatest strengths were shadowed by human desire, exploitation, and the pursuit of pleasure at the expense of others. The sexual underground reminds us that Rome's grandeur was inseparable from its darkness, that its glory coexisted with a hidden world of suffering and secrecy. As we move from the clandestine chambers of the sexual underground to the streets, public spaces, and baths, it becomes evident that Rome's fascination with excess did not stop at pleasure. It extended to disease, filth, and hidden suffering, a reminder that beneath every layer of civilization, human vulnerability and decay persisted. Rome's grandeur, with its towering temples and bustling marketplaces, often obscures a much darker reality: the daily struggle against disease, filth, and human vulnerability. While historians celebrate aqueducts, baths, and public sanitation, the majority of Romans lived in conditions that were unsanitary, crowded, and hazardous. Beneath the city's marble facades and monumental arches lay an underworld of suffering few dare to imagine. The densely populated insulae, or apartment blocks, housed the majority of the urban poor. These multi-story buildings were often constructed cheaply and haphazardly, with little regard for fire safety or structural stability. Water supply was limited, sewage disposal rudimentary, and hygiene largely dependent on access to public facilities. Latrines were shared, often overflowing, and waste was dumped into streets or the Tiber River. Disease thrived in this environment, spreading quickly through vermin, contaminated water, and close quarters. Plagues and epidemics were a constant threat. Historical accounts describe outbreaks of fever, dysentery, and other infectious diseases that could decimate populations within weeks. The crowded, unsanitary living conditions accelerated transmission, making Rome a breeding ground for illness. Doctors existed, but medical knowledge was rudimentary. Treatments were often based on superstition, religious ritual, or herbal remedies with limited effectiveness. Many Romans died not from war or conquest, but from the invisible enemies of bacteria and filth. Even the elite were not immune, though their wealth offered partial protection. Patricians had access to private baths, better food, and cleaner living spaces, but the city itself remained a shared environment. Rivers, streets, and markets teeming with waste created a constant risk. In some accounts, wealthy families retreated to villas in the countryside to escape the stench, disease, and chaos of urban life. These retreats, however, only highlighted the inequality at the heart of Rome. The city flourished for some while collapsing in misery for many. Public baths, often celebrated as marvels of hygiene, were paradoxically also sources of disease. Bathhouses were crowded and shared by hundreds of people daily. Water was not always changed, and facilities were breeding grounds for lice, fungi, and other pathogens. Despite these dangers, bathing was an essential aspect of Roman culture, social interaction, and even political networking. The desire for cleanliness coexisted with the inevitability of sickness. Food scarcity and contamination added another layer of suffering. Bread, the staple of the Roman diet, was often adulterated with chalk or other substances to increase volume. Spoiled grain led to malnutrition and illness, particularly among the poor. Meat, fish, and dairy products were prone to spoilage due to the lack of refrigeration. Foodborne illnesses were common, further weakening the population and perpetuating cycles of vulnerability. Children were particularly at risk. Infant mortality was high, with estimates suggesting that nearly half of all children did not survive past early childhood. Poor sanitation, limited medical care, and the physical demands of survival made childhood a perilous stage of life. Parents often faced impossible choices. Balancing scarce resources, disease, and harsh labor demands in a society that offered little support for the weak or vulnerable. The Tiber River, central to Rome's identity, was both a lifeline and a hazard. While it facilitated trade, transportation, and water supply, it was also heavily polluted. Waste, industrial runoff, and corpses could be found in the river, turning it into a vector for disease. Floods and contamination compounded health risks, and yet the city continued to rely on this vital artery, demonstrating the fragile balance between civilization and collapse. Compounding this suffering was the pervasive inequality of health access. Physicians were available, but often only to those who could pay. Remedies for the poor were improvised, inconsistent, and largely ineffective. Wealth and status determined survival as much as biology or fortune. Rome's achievements in engineering and public infrastructure existed alongside the daily realities of hunger, filth, and sickness. The psychological toll of living in these conditions cannot be overstated. Fear of disease, injury, and death was omnipresent. Families lived with uncertainty, knowing that accidents, illness, or epidemics could strike at any moment. For the enslaved and the urban poor, suffering was compounded by labor demands, violence, and exploitation. Life in Rome was a constant negotiation with vulnerability, survival, and despair. Even the celebrations, spectacles, and public festivals that drew citizens together could exacerbate the spread of disease. Crowded gatherings, gladiatorial games, and markets became vectors for illness, turning pleasure into peril. Romans were acutely aware of this tension, yet social cohesion, entertainment, and survival required participation in these very spaces that threatened their health. Ultimately, the hidden suffering of Rome, the filth, disease, and human vulnerability, reveals a civilization that, for all its achievements, rested on fragile foundations. While monuments and aqueducts endure as symbols of ingenuity, the daily reality for the majority was one of relentless struggle. The empire's grandeur was inseparable from the human cost, death, illness, and misery, often invisible in historical narratives but ever present in the lives of ordinary Romans. By confronting this reality, we see Rome not merely as an empire of marble and conquest, but as a living, breathing society where survival was a precarious balance, and suffering was as much a part of daily life as law, ritual, or spectacle. The hidden decay and disease of Rome remind us that behind every triumph and monument, there was a human story marked by vulnerability, endurance, and often, silent despair. Rome's streets may have been paved with marble, its temples gleaming in the sunlight, but beneath this surface lay a world of hidden crimes and secret violence that most citizens would never admit existed. The empire was built on conquest, law, and order, yet criminality thrived in shadows, exploiting the gaps between authority, surveillance, and human desire. From domestic treachery to organized schemes, from covert assassinations to street-level thievery, Rome's darker side was omnipresent, invisible to the casual observer but deadly to those caught within it. The most common forms of crime were often those that preyed on vulnerability, theft, extortion, and fraud. Insulae, the crowded apartment blocks of the urban poor, were hotbeds of petty crime. Pickpockets and burglars moved with practiced skill, taking advantage of narrow streets and chaotic markets. Shops could be robbed, homes broken into, and food supplies stolen. While laws existed, enforcement was inconsistent, often favoring those with wealth or influence. For the ordinary citizen, survival meant vigilance and cunning, and trust was a scarce commodity. Violence, however, extended far beyond simple theft. Domestic abuse, often ignored by authorities, was rampant. Husbands, fathers, and masters wielded absolute authority over women, children, and slaves. Brutality within households was common, and victims had little recourse. While historical sources focus on public events and legal proceedings, the private violence endured by families and slaves shaped everyday life, creating a climate of fear that extended from bedrooms to workshops and farms. Assassination was another tool of both power and personal vendetta. Senators, magistrates, and even emperors were not immune. Political rivals could be eliminated through poison, ambush, or carefully orchestrated accidents. Secrecy was paramount, assassination required planning, bribery, and the complicity of insiders. Failure meant execution, imprisonment, or disgrace, yet the lure of power or revenge drove men to risk everything. The threat of sudden, hidden death haunted both the elite and the ambitious. Organized gangs also operated in Rome's underbelly. Groups of thieves, hired enforcers, and smugglers coordinated activity across the city. They preyed on travelers, merchants, and even citizens of influence, demanding bribes or protection fees. These networks were often linked to political corruption, offering services to powerful patrons in exchange for protection or influence. Violence and intimidation were standard, reinforcing a social hierarchy where the strong exploited the weak, and law often depended on who could pay for it. The legal system itself sometimes facilitated secret violence. Trials could be manipulated, witnesses bribed, and verdicts bought. Citizens who sought justice were often met with obstacles, intimidation, or outright threats. Roman society rewarded cunning as much as valor, and those skilled in deception could navigate the system to their advantage. Conversely, those without wealth, influence, or allies often suffered in silence, their grievances unresolved. In this way, crime became intertwined with the structures of authority, making the line between legality and criminality almost imperceptible. Slavery compounded the prevalence of hidden violence. Enslaved individuals endured beatings, overwork, and sexual abuse, often under the watchful eye of masters who treated cruelty as routine. Rebellions, though rare, were brutally suppressed. The most famous, led by Spartacus in the 1st century BCE, reminded the empire that enslaved populations could organize and challenge authority, but the punishment for failure was absolute: crucifixion along the Appian Way, a public warning soaked in blood. Fear maintained control, and the omnipresence of violence ensured that rebellion was nearly impossible to sustain. Street violence was also common. Urban centers teemed with tension. Crowds in markets, public baths, or theaters could erupt into brawls. Rival factions, whether political supporters, gladiatorial fans, or neighborhood gangs, often clashed violently. The authorities, limited by manpower and geography, could intervene only sporadically. For ordinary Romans, daily life involved navigating not only disease, corruption, and exploitation but also the constant risk of assault, theft, or coercion. Hidden violence also extended into the spiritual and religious sphere. Certain cults and secret societies used intimidation, threats, or even murder to maintain loyalty and secrecy. Initiates could be punished for betrayal or exposed as traitors, often through brutal means. The shadow world of ritualized violence, entwined with superstition and fear, created layers of coercion that remained invisible to outsiders. Even politics itself was often a game of clandestine cruelty. Senators plotted assassinations, governors embezzled funds, and emperors orchestrated purges. The line between private vendetta and political maneuvering was blurred. Fear of hidden enemies, conspiracies, and betrayal permeated the lives of the powerful, while ordinary citizens were caught in the crossfire of intrigue, sometimes unknowingly. Violence was both a tool and a currency, used to shape society from behind closed doors. What emerges from this hidden world is a society where survival required vigilance, cunning, and sometimes ruthlessness. Crime, secrecy, and violence were woven into the fabric of Roman life, from the humblest insula to the emperor's palace. The empire's outward splendor masked these undercurrents, but the human cost was undeniable. Every theft, assault, and assassination reminds us that Rome's power and prestige were inseparable from fear, coercion, and suffering. By examining these hidden crimes and secret violence, we gain a deeper understanding of Rome as a civilization not just of triumph, architecture, and conquest, but also of shadowed human cruelty, exploitation, and danger. The city's grandeur was inseparable from the clandestine acts that sustained it, revealing a society where the line between civilization and chaos was razor-thin, and where darkness thrived behind even the most magnificent facades. From a distance, Rome appeared invincible. Its roads stretched across continents, its legions disciplined and feared, its architecture a testament to human ingenuity. Yet beneath this polished surface, the empire's foundations were far less stable than its monuments suggested. Political instability, economic inequality, social decay, and the ever-present shadow of violence and disease made the facade of power dangerously brittle. One of the most striking vulnerabilities of Rome was its dependence on human labor and obedience. Enslaved populations powered much of the economy, from agricultural estates to construction sites. Yet slavery was inherently unstable. Revolts, though infrequent, posed existential threats to the system. The fear of rebellion pervaded both public policy and private life. Masters relied on brutality, surveillance, and psychological control to maintain dominance, but this precarious system was a constant reminder that Rome's power depended on coercion as much as loyalty or respect. Political corruption exacerbated this fragility. Senators, magistrates, and governors were frequently more concerned with personal enrichment than with effective governance. Mismanagement of provinces, embezzlement of public funds, and favoritism undermined social cohesion. Laws existed, but enforcement was inconsistent, creating gaps where ambition and deceit could flourish. The empire's authority depended as much on perception as reality, and the illusion of stability masked cracks that could, and eventually did, widen into crises. Economic pressures further exposed Rome's vulnerability. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority struggled with poverty, hunger, and insecurity. Heavy taxation, combined with inflation and corruption in food distribution, fueled resentment and unrest. Markets were unpredictable, and shortages could trigger riots, forcing the state to intervene with both bread and violence. The empire's prosperity was thus an illusion maintained by exploitation and fear, a fragile equilibrium that required constant vigilance. Even Rome's military might, often seen as its ultimate guarantee of stability, had inherent weaknesses. Legions were loyal to commanders rather than the state, creating opportunities for civil war and political upheaval. Emperors were deposed, assassinated, or overthrown with alarming regularity. Soldiers could be bribed, incited, or led astray, demonstrating that control over the empire relied not only on strength but also on loyalty, discipline, and fear, a combination that was far from guaranteed. Social cohesion was another precarious pillar. Roman society was fragmented, with stark divisions between classes, genders, and free citizens versus slaves. The elite indulged in luxury and spectacle, while the poor contended with disease, filth, and violence. Bread and circuses offered temporary distraction, but they could not mask deep resentment. Civil unrest, riots, and localized uprisings were recurring features of urban life, highlighting the fragility of social order beneath the empire's glamorous surface. Cultural contradictions also contributed to Rome's precariousness. Public morality emphasized honor, duty, and piety, yet private life often involved deception, indulgence, and vice. Secret cults, underground sexual practices, and covert acts of violence thrived precisely because the public facade demanded conformity. The empire's strength depended on appearances, stability, order, and civilization. Yet the reality was a society living with constant tension, fear, and moral ambiguity. Natural disasters added another unpredictable layer of instability. Floods, fires, and earthquakes could devastate cities, disrupt trade, and spread disease. The empire's reliance on infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, and aqueduct-fed cities, meant that environmental shocks could have far-reaching social and economic consequences. Rome's ability to recover depended on resources, organization, and luck, highlighting just how vulnerable even a superpower could be to forces beyond its control. Perhaps most strikingly, Rome's very ideology contributed to its fragility. The empire projected power, civilization, and divine favor, yet these narratives were carefully constructed illusions. Citizens were taught to revere the state, obey authority, and participate in rituals that reinforced hierarchy. Yet the underlying reality, disease, poverty, corruption, and hidden violence, contradicted this image at every level. The empire's legitimacy rested on perception, and perception could easily crumble under pressure. The fragile facade was evident in everyday life. Citizens enjoyed public spectacles, feasts, and markets, yet were constantly reminded of mortality, disease, and instability. Slaves and the poor lived in perpetual fear, while the elite navigated intrigue and threat. Even small disruptions, an epidemic, a failed harvest, or a riot, could ripple outward, revealing how little separated order from chaos. The empire's stability was a house of cards, impressive from afar but vulnerable to the slightest disturbance. Understanding the fragility of Rome's facade reshapes our perception of the empire. Its monuments, military conquests, and administrative achievements were real, but they were supported by coercion, fear, and illusion. Beneath the triumphs lay a society constantly negotiating survival, morality, and obedience. The empire's grandeur was inseparable from its vulnerabilities, reminding us that power is as much a performance as it is a reality. As we step back to observe the broader picture, we see that Rome's strength was inseparable from its weaknesses. The empire dazzled, inspired, and terrorized simultaneously. Its facade was magnificent, yet fragile, masking the suffering, corruption, and instability that ultimately defined its internal reality. This awareness prepares us for the final reflection, how the hidden darkness of Rome shaped not only its demise but also its enduring legacy. Rome's hidden darkness was not merely a historical curiosity, it cast a long shadow over the centuries that followed, shaping culture, governance, and societal norms long after the last emperor fell. While textbooks often celebrate the empire's engineering marvels, legal systems, and military conquests, the less visible elements of corruption, vice, and cruelty had an equally enduring impact. By understanding this legacy, we gain a richer perspective on how Rome's internal decay influenced the civilizations that rose from its ashes. The moral contradictions of Rome, glorifying virtue in public while indulging in vice in private, became embedded in European culture. Literature, theater, and later art frequently explored themes of power, corruption, and human depravity, echoing the hidden realities of the empire. Writers from Cicero to Juvenal documented excess, moral decay, and social injustice, creating a cultural memory of Rome as both glorious and morally ambiguous. This duality shaped how subsequent societies viewed governance, morality, and civic responsibility. Roman law, celebrated for its sophistication, also reflects the empire's darker side. While principles of justice and codified statutes advanced civilization, their application was often inconsistent and favoring the elite. Subsequent legal traditions inherited not only the strengths of Roman jurisprudence but also its inequalities, highlighting the enduring tension between law as ideal and law as instrument of power. The legacy of privilege, corruption, and selective justice can be traced through centuries of European legal systems. The spectacle of violence, too, left an indelible mark. Gladiatorial games may have ended, but the concept of public execution, staged terror, and controlled brutality persisted across Europe. Medieval and early modern rulers emulated aspects of Roman pageantry and punishment, reinforcing authority through fear. The psychological understanding of crowd manipulation and spectacle, perfected in Roman arenas, informed the governance and social control strategies of many societies long after the empire's collapse. Rome's sexual underground and tolerance of vice also echoed across generations. Elite indulgence, secret cults, and private exploitation influenced social hierarchies and gender norms in successor civilizations. The duality of public morality versus private behavior, of appearance versus reality, became a recurring motif in European courts, literature, and social regulation. Lessons, both cautionary and aspirational, were drawn from Rome's indulgences, shaping attitudes toward power, pleasure, and morality. Perhaps most profoundly, Rome's fragility taught later societies about the limits of empire. The collapse of central authority, exacerbated by internal corruption, inequality, and hidden violence, became a blueprint for understanding societal vulnerability. Scholars, rulers, and philosophers studied Rome's decline to extract lessons about governance, military strategy, and civic responsibility. The empire's achievements were admired, but its failures were dissected as warnings, a reminder that grandeur could coexist with decay. Religious evolution also bore the imprint of Rome's hidden darkness. Christianity, emerging amid persecution and clandestine practices, absorbed and reacted to Roman culture. Its emphasis on morality, community, and accountability can be seen as a response to the corruption, violence, and moral ambiguity pervasive in Roman life. Roman vice, superstition, and exploitation created a societal vacuum that new religions sought to address, framing morality as a counterpoint to the empire's hidden depravity. In urban design and infrastructure, the tension between public grandeur and private neglect persisted. Cities inherited Roman engineering and architectural principles, yet the inequalities Rome tolerated, between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, continued to shape urban life. Crowded streets, vulnerability to disease, and social stratification were problems that Rome left behind, influencing urban planning for centuries. The physical and social lessons of Rome's hidden decay became embedded in the blueprint of Western civilization. Ultimately, the legacy of Rome's darkness is a reminder that power and civilization are inseparable from human imperfection. Behind every monument, law, or conquest lay human desires, weaknesses, and cruelty. The empire's achievements were inseparable from its exploitation, corruption, and hidden suffering. By studying these elements, we recognize that history is not merely a celebration of accomplishments, but a nuanced narrative where shadow and light coexist, shaping societies long after the events themselves. The darkness of Rome also informs our understanding of human nature. It reveals how power can corrupt, how fear can control populations, and how spectacle and manipulation can shape behavior. These lessons are timeless, resonating not just in historical scholarship but in contemporary governance, culture, and society. Rome's hidden truths, once obscured, offer insights into the complexities of civilization, reminding us that grandeur often depends on compromise, and stability is always provisional. As we prepare to conclude our journey through Rome's shadowed corridors, it becomes clear that the empire's story is as much about hidden darkness as it is about triumph. Its legacy is a tapestry woven from brilliance and depravity, spectacle and suffering, virtue and vice. Understanding this legacy allows us to appreciate Rome not merely as an empire of conquest, but as a civilization defined by its contradictions, whose lessons continue to echo through history. When history remembers World War II, it often remembers the soldiers, the generals, the battles, and the weapons. But behind the front lines, in bombed-out cities and occupied villages, another war was unfolding, one that was not fought with rifles or tanks, but with hunger, fear, and the daily struggle to survive. For millions of civilians, the war was not about victory or defeat, but about staying alive for one more day. And while official propaganda downplayed this suffering, rare photographs tell us otherwise. They reveal the faces of men, women, and children caught in the storm of history, left to endure hardships that no poster or newsreel ever showed. One of the most striking truths these hidden images capture is the sheer scale of displacement. Entire populations were uprooted, forced to flee their homes in search of safety. Families carried what little they could on their backs or in handcarts, blankets, pots, a few clothes. Some clutched heirlooms, others carried nothing at all. Rare photographs show endless lines of civilians walking along muddy roads, pushing strollers without babies, dragging wagons filled with their last belongings. The expressions on their faces speak volumes: blank stares of shock, quiet tears, the exhausted slump of bodies too tired to hope. Official wartime media rarely showed these refugee columns. They disrupted the narrative of progress and control. Yet in these photographs, the silent tragedy of dislocation becomes impossible to ignore. Children, in particular, bore the brunt of civilian suffering. Propaganda often depicted them as symbols of innocence protected by brave soldiers and governments. But the suppressed images tell a darker truth. We see photographs of children clutching dolls amid rubble, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Some stand barefoot in the cold, their clothing in tatters. Others are shown huddled together in air raid shelters, wide-eyed with fear, waiting for the next bombing raid to end. One haunting photograph from Warsaw shows a small boy, no more than 6, standing alone with a bucket, his eyes vacant after his family had been lost in the chaos. These are not the images that leaders wanted their people to see, for they revealed not the glory of war, but its cruelty toward the most vulnerable. In occupied cities, life was defined by scarcity. Food shortages were constant, and civilians faced rationing that pushed them to the brink of starvation. Hidden photographs taken secretly in Nazi-occupied Europe show women standing in impossibly long breadlines, their cheeks hollow, their eyes sunken. Others depict black markets operating in secret, where desperate people traded jewelry, clothing, or even family heirlooms for a few scraps of food. In Greece, Rare images captured children fainting in the streets during the famine of 1941–42, when hundreds of thousands died of hunger. These photographs were too painful to broadcast at the time. They challenged the idea that governments were protecting their people. Instead, they revealed the terrible cost of war on those with no power and no weapons. But survival was not only about hunger, it was also about fear. Under occupation, every decision could mean life or death. Photographs from France, Poland, and the Netherlands show civilians walking cautiously past soldiers, eyes averted, bodies tense. Posters announcing executions or curfews were plastered on walls behind them. Rare candid shots reveal the quiet dread etched into everyday life. In one photograph, a woman clutches her child tightly as she passes armed guards on a street corner. In another, a group of men whisper together in a cafe, glancing nervously at the door. These images capture a truth absent from staged wartime news. For civilians, daily life was a careful dance with danger, a constant balancing act between submission and resistance. Another rarely seen aspect of civilian life was the resilience they showed in the face of destruction. Bombings destroyed entire neighborhoods in London, Berlin, Tokyo, and countless other cities. Official propaganda often showed civilians smiling bravely among ruins, reinforcing the idea of national spirit. But the hidden photographs tell a more complex story. They reveal families digging frantically through rubble in search of loved ones, women weeping over collapsed homes, elderly men staring in despair at streets reduced to ash. These moments of raw grief and helplessness did not fit the heroic narrative, and so they were seldom published. Yet they are essential for understanding the human cost of the war. They remind us that behind every collapsed building was not just debris, but lives shattered beyond repair. Despite the horror, rare photos also capture fleeting moments of humanity and defiance. In some, children are seen playing games in bombed-out streets, using broken helmets as toys. In others, families gather around makeshift tables, sharing what little food they have with quiet dignity. These moments do not erase the suffering, but they show that even in the darkest times, people clung to small acts of normalcy. Governments rarely wanted these images shown, because they complicated the binary narrative of either despair or heroism. Yet they speak to something deeper, the resilience of ordinary people who endured horrors that soldiers at the front might never have imagined. The suppression of these images was deliberate. Governments wanted to keep civilians in the background of the war, both figuratively and literally. They were not the heroes of the battlefield, nor the villains of the story. They were the collateral damage. By hiding these photographs, leaders kept public attention on victories, defeats, and the machinery of war, rather than on the silent suffering happening in every occupied street and every bombed-out home. Only decades later, when these images surfaced from private collections and forgotten archives, did the world begin to see the war through civilian eyes. Looking at these rare photographs today forces us to reconsider how we understand World War II. It was not just a clash of armies and ideologies, it was also a catastrophe that engulfed ordinary people, most of whom never carried a weapon. The hidden images of refugees, starving children, and grieving families reveal a dimension of the war that official history books once ignored. They remind us that while generals plotted strategies and politicians gave speeches, millions of civilians simply tried to survive. Their stories were not told at the time, but through these suppressed photographs, they finally demand recognition. In the end, these forgotten civilians form the silent majority of World War II. Their faces, etched with hunger, fear, and endurance, are as much a part of the war as any battlefield. By bringing their images into the light, we not only honor their suffering but also uncover a truth governments once worked so hard to conceal, that the greatest battles of the war were not always fought with guns, but in the kitchens, shelters, and ruined streets where ordinary people struggled simply to live. When armies moved across Europe, Asia, and North Africa during World War II, their presence did not end at the front lines. Behind the fighting, an invisible, often brutal war unfolded in every occupied city and village, a war fought against civilians, against culture, and against the ordinary rhythms of daily life. While history often highlights battles and military campaigns, the rare photographs that survived the era expose a much darker truth. Occupation was a psychological, social, and often deadly experience that left scars far deeper than the trenches. Occupying forces often imposed strict rules on local populations. Curfews, rationing, forced labor, and identity checks became part of everyday life. Rare photographs from occupied Poland, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands illustrate how normal life was transformed into a tense game of survival. In some images, residents line up at checkpoints, nervously showing papers to soldiers whose faces are often masked by authority. In others, we see street signs marking restricted zones, or posters warning that punishment would be swift for those who defied orders. The tension in these photographs is palpable. Every glance over the shoulder, every cautious step, reflects an underlying fear that permeated civilian existence. But occupation went beyond rules, it reshaped the social fabric. Communities were forced to accommodate foreign soldiers, sometimes sharing homes, streets, and resources with men who were strangers, sometimes hostile. Rare images reveal the uneasy coexistence: children playing under the watchful eye of a soldier, neighbors exchanging goods while carefully avoiding attention, families attempting to maintain rituals in the shadow of armed occupation. These photos highlight the subtle psychological warfare imposed on civilians, the constant pressure to appear compliant while secretly preserving dignity and normalcy. Life under occupation was a tightrope, a performance dictated by fear and survival instincts. Resistance, both overt and covert, was another dangerous element captured in these hidden photographs. In occupied Europe, underground networks smuggled food, medicine, and intelligence. Clandestine groups sabotaged railways, factories, and communication lines. Many rare photographs show ordinary citizens performing acts of quiet defiance: a woman secretly passing food to a partisan, a child delivering messages, a worker marking a factory machine to delay production for the enemy. These moments were perilous. If discovered, the consequences were immediate and often fatal. The photographs themselves were hazardous to possess. Being caught with them could mean imprisonment, deportation, or execution. Their existence today gives us a window into courage that official records often ignored. Some of the most haunting rare photographs show the consequences of disobedience or suspicion. Public punishments were staged to maintain control. Soldiers sometimes forced civilians to stand in front of a firing squad or kneel in humiliation as crowds watched. Photographs of these moments are grim and unsettling, often hidden for decades. They reveal that occupation was not merely about strategic control, but also about domination and terror. The camera captures not only the victim's fear, but the calculated method through which occupiers sought to instill obedience across entire populations. The images are stark reminders that for civilians, the war was fought in every street, home, and school, not just on the front lines. Yet not all aspects of occupation were overtly violent. Many photographs show subtle forms of exploitation that were just as impactful. In some occupied regions, civilians were coerced into labor, repairing roads, building fortifications, or working in factories producing war materials. Rare images depict exhausted men and women, bent under heavy loads, their hands blistered, their clothing tattered. While these scenes might not match the immediate horror of bombing or shootings, they convey a slow, grinding oppression that wore down morale and spirit over time. The mundane cruelty of occupation often left invisible scars: broken families, lost childhoods, and communities permanently altered by forced labor and deprivation. Interestingly, hidden photographs also capture moments of human adaptation amid oppression. People found ways to celebrate, resist, or maintain small joys despite the ever-present danger. In some images, neighbors gather in basements or abandoned buildings for secret meetings, weddings, or even makeshift theaters. Others show children drawing chalk pictures on the street, subtly defying curfews, or women exchanging clandestine letters and gifts. These moments are rare because they were hidden deliberately. Occupying authorities wanted to suppress evidence of civilian resilience, fearing it might inspire wider resistance. Today, these photographs are invaluable for understanding the full human dimension of occupation, a world where fear and courage existed side by side, constantly negotiating the boundaries of survival. The psychological weight of occupation extended beyond physical danger. Many rare photographs reveal faces marked by uncertainty, anxiety, and despair. Elderly men and women sit quietly in their ruined homes, staring at walls that once held memories now destroyed. Children clutch parents who are too exhausted or traumatized to offer comfort. In cafes and marketplaces, adults whisper in hushed tones, aware that a single misstep could draw attention from armed forces. The photos are not staged, they capture the raw, lived experience of living under constant scrutiny and threat. For historians and viewers alike, they offer a glimpse of the invisible battles fought in the minds and hearts of ordinary civilians. By examining these rare images, we gain a more complete understanding of occupation as a form of warfare in its own right. It was a war of rules, restrictions, and intimidation, fought not with bullets alone but through fear, control, and suppression of the human spirit. These photographs challenge the sanitized versions of occupation often presented in textbooks or mainstream media. They reveal that behind every propaganda poster, every official statement of "order restored," there was a lived reality of fear, defiance, endurance, and loss. Civilians were not just witnesses to history, they were its quiet, unwilling participants, often paying a cost far greater than that recognized at the time. In essence, the dark side of occupation shows us that war is not only fought on battlefields. It invades homes, schools, and streets, shaping the daily lives of millions. Rare photographs from this period do more than document, they bear witness. They reveal the hidden dimensions of a war that many thought they knew, showing that the real struggle for survival often unfolded far from the headlines, in the silent, tense, and dangerous spaces where ordinary people lived, worked, and resisted. By examining these images, we honor the courage and endurance of civilians who navigated this perilous world, keeping alive the quiet flame of humanity in the darkest of times. When we think of World War II soldiers, the images that often come to mind are of disciplined troops marching in formation, grim-faced men advancing across battlefields, and heroic charges against enemy lines. Yet behind the front lines, away from the chaos of gunfire and explosions, soldiers led lives that were often starkly different from the mythic narratives of heroism. Rare photographs from this period reveal moments of vulnerability, humor, exhaustion, and even absurdity, moments that were rarely captured in official wartime media, yet they tell a story about the human side of those caught in the machinery of war. One of the most striking aspects revealed in these hidden images is the exhaustion that soldiers carried like a silent burden. In countless photographs, men are seen collapsed in the mud, asleep on crates, or slumped against walls, their weapons discarded beside them. Their uniforms are filthy, torn, and stained, and their faces betray the mental and physical toll of constant vigilance and danger. While propaganda often depicted soldiers as tireless, smiling warriors, these candid photos show the grittier reality. War was as much about endurance as it was about courage. Every pause, every moment of rest captured in these images speaks volumes about the relentless strain of the front. Humor and camaraderie, though less discussed, also play a significant role in these rare photographs. Soldiers often found ways to maintain morale through pranks, jokes, and improvised games. One image shows a group of men playing cards atop a damaged tank, laughing despite the destruction surrounding them. Another depicts soldiers trying to balance on a makeshift seesaw fashioned from crates and barrels. These photographs reveal the resilience of human spirit, even in dire circumstances. While official war photography emphasized discipline and heroism, these candid moments remind us that soldiers were people first, capable of joy, mischief, and fleeting normalcy. Hobbies and pastimes off-duty were another dimension captured in these rare photographs. Soldiers would draw, write letters, play musical instruments, or even engage in sports during brief respites from combat. Some images depict men painting sketches of their surroundings, perhaps as a way to process trauma, or writing letters that would never be sent due to censorship. Others show impromptu soccer matches in bombed-out villages or snowball fights in winter trenches. These activities might seem trivial against the backdrop of global conflict, yet they were essential for maintaining mental health and a sense of humanity. Rare photos of these moments are treasured because they reveal the complexity of soldiering. Life persisted, in small and sometimes absurd ways, even amid devastation. Food and drink also emerge as recurring themes in these hidden photographs. Soldiers are often shown sharing meager rations, sneaking bites from forbidden stores, or raising cups in celebration of small victories. One photograph captures a group huddled around a makeshift stove, steam rising from a pot of watered-down soup. Another shows a soldier carefully splitting a chocolate bar with a comrade. These images, simple as they appear, underscore the basic human needs that continue to exist regardless of battle plans or propaganda. Hunger, thirst, and the desire for comfort were universal, transcending rank, nationality, and ideology. Yet not all moments off duty were light-hearted. Many rare images reveal the psychological scars inflicted by combat. Soldiers are photographed sitting alone, staring into the distance, faces etched with anxiety or grief. Some images show men smoking or staring blankly at destroyed landscapes, attempting to process what they have witnessed. One haunting photograph shows a young soldier holding a photograph of his family, tears streaking his dirt-smeared face. These rare glimpses provide insight into the hidden emotional toll of war, a narrative almost entirely absent from official publications, which preferred to highlight bravery over vulnerability. The contrast between staged heroism and the candid reality is particularly stark when examining photographs from temporary rest periods behind the lines. While official photography depicted soldiers always alert, organized, and disciplined, candid images reveal cluttered sleeping quarters, poorly maintained equipment, and moments of tension between comrades. Arguments, pranks gone wrong, or simple mistakes were captured in these photographs, offering a more nuanced, humanized view of army life. It reminds viewers that soldiers, despite training and discipline, were still ordinary men subject to fatigue, fear, and fleeting moments of folly. Some rare photographs also capture soldiers attempting to maintain personal rituals or identities amid chaos. Religious observances, personal grooming, and small acts of self-expression appear in hidden images. A soldier lighting a candle in a makeshift chapel, another polishing a boot, or a group quietly singing in the corner of a damaged building, all reveal the ways in which men clung to fragments of normalcy. These moments, seemingly minor, were vital for preserving morale and psychological stability. They also serve as a stark counterpoint to the simplified narratives of war as pure heroism or pure horror. Interestingly, soldiers' interactions with civilians off-duty also appear in rare photographs, often in ways that contradict official narratives. Some images show soldiers sharing food with local children, assisting elderly residents, or quietly repairing damaged homes. Others, however, reveal tension, resentment, and conflict, a reminder that occupying forces and allied soldiers were not universally welcomed. These interactions complicate our understanding of the war, showing that it was fought not just between armies, but in the overlapping spaces of humanity and survival, trust and suspicion, help and harm. In the end, the rare photographs of soldiers off duty remind us that war is not only about battles won or lost. It is about the small, intimate moments that rarely make it into history books, the laughter, the exhaustion, the fleeting joys, the quiet despair. They reveal a truth often hidden behind propaganda and heroic narratives. Soldiers were human beings, enduring unimaginable conditions, struggling to maintain their identities, connections, and sanity. By examining these hidden moments, we gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of what it truly meant to live and survive as a soldier during the darkest chapters of the 20th century. World War II is often remembered for the colossal battles, the iconic leaders, and the vast armies clashing across continents. Yet beneath the surface of conventional combat, another war was being waged, the war of invention, experimentation, and technological audacity. Governments and militaries poured resources into creating weapons and machines that could offer even the smallest advantage. Some became legends, like the Spitfire or the Sherman tank, but many others remained secret, strange, or even abandoned, rare photographs of which reveal a side of the war that borders on the surreal. The push for technological supremacy was relentless. Engineers and scientists were under intense pressure to develop tools that could turn the tide of battle. In Germany, for example, projects like the V-2 rocket, jet aircraft, and experimental tanks were born out of both ambition and desperation. Rare photographs from secret facilities show engineers inspecting blueprints beside half-assembled weapons, or prototypes that look more like science fiction than reality. These were not polished propaganda images, they were snapshots of human ingenuity operating at the edge of feasibility, where brilliance often collided with the impossible. Some of the most intriguing photographs capture bizarre prototypes that never saw widespread use. In one image, a tank is fitted with an unusually elongated barrel and additional armor plates, its design awkward and almost comical by modern standards. Another shows a vehicle with enormous wheels designed to cross rough terrain, resembling a mechanical spider more than a tank. These machines were built with high hopes but often failed under testing conditions. They reveal not only the ingenuity of wartime engineers but also the desperation of nations seeking a technological edge. The very fact that these images survived, hidden in dusty archives or secret labs, gives us a rare glimpse into experiments that were deemed too sensitive or too strange for public consumption. Weapons themselves took on forms that seem surreal to contemporary eyes. Germany's Schwerer Gustav railway gun, one of the largest artillery pieces ever constructed, was designed to fire shells over astonishing distances, yet photographs reveal the monumental logistical effort required to move and assemble it. Hidden images show massive crews assembling tracks, positioning the gun, and attempting to manage the chaos of its operation. The human element, often invisible in official records, is critical. Such projects required hundreds of men working tirelessly under dangerous conditions, a reminder that behind every technological marvel were human lives at risk. On the Allied side, secret projects also produced unusual and ambitious designs. Engineers experimented with amphibious vehicles, experimental aircraft, and remote-controlled tanks. Rare photographs reveal prototypes abandoned mid-construction, crumpled by technical failures or logistical impracticalities. Some images show planes with unconventional shapes, odd wing angles, or extra engines, each designed to offer speed or maneuverability advantages. Others depict makeshift inventions cobbled together with whatever materials were available, reflecting ingenuity born out of scarcity. These images are haunting in their ambition. They show a constant push to imagine and create beyond conventional limits, even if the results were imperfect or impractical. Interestingly, many of these rare photographs also capture the human responses to these technological experiments. Soldiers and engineers are often seen handling equipment with curiosity, confusion, or even amusement. In one candid photo, a group of men examines a tank fitted with experimental attachments, scratching their heads as if unsure how it is supposed to operate. In another, a pilot poses beside a peculiar aircraft, its odd proportions almost comical, yet carrying the hope of strategic advantage. These images humanize the process of invention, reminding viewers that behind every piece of technology was trial, error, and the personal effort of countless individuals. The intersection of secrecy and danger adds another layer to these photographs. Many experimental weapons were tested in remote locations or underground facilities, away from public scrutiny. Rare images capture engineers and soldiers observing tests of rocket prototypes, flamethrowers, or chemical delivery systems. Smoke, explosions, and improvised safety measures dominate the scene. Some images are chilling reminders of the risks involved. A failed test could maim or kill, yet these were accepted as part of the pursuit of advantage. The photographs serve as a visual testimony to both human daring and human vulnerability in the shadow of war. Another fascinating aspect captured in these hidden images is the blending of science and improvisation. Resource shortages, urgency, and battlefield demands often forced engineers to repurpose materials or invent unorthodox solutions. One photograph shows a tank retrofitted with extra metal plating scavenged from destroyed vehicles, another depicts a plane reinforced with wooden supports in an attempt to improve durability. These hybrid creations, sometimes laughable in appearance, reveal a wartime reality where necessity drove creativity, and where survival often depended on experimentation as much as strategy. Propaganda, of course, rarely reflected these experimental failures. Official images focused on successes, polished machines, and celebrated inventors, leaving the abandoned or impractical projects invisible. It is only through these rare, hidden photographs that we gain insight into the full spectrum of wartime technology, the triumphs, the failures, and the strange middle ground where ambition met reality. Each photograph tells a story, not only of innovation but of the human curiosity and audacity that defined an era obsessed with achieving the impossible. Finally, these images remind us that the technological race of World War II was not purely mechanical, it was deeply human. Behind each prototype, each strange weapon, were the hopes, fears, and relentless efforts of countless men and women. They remind us that war, while catastrophic, can also push the boundaries of invention, often in ways that seem absurd or surreal to later generations. These rare photographs allow us to see not just machines, but the human ambition, desperation, and creativity that shaped them. And in viewing them, we confront a side of World War II that is rarely discussed: the hidden laboratories, the abandoned blueprints, and the extraordinary, often unrealized, possibilities of wartime ingenuity. While armies clashed across continents and governments orchestrated massive propaganda campaigns, a quieter, deadlier struggle unfolded in the shadows: the resistance. Across occupied Europe, Asia, and beyond, ordinary civilians, students, workers, and even some soldiers undertook perilous missions to undermine the enemy. They were spies, saboteurs, couriers, and unsung heroes whose stories rarely made it into history books. Yet rare photographs captured these clandestine moments, moments that were hidden, suppressed, or too dangerous to publish at the time. Today, these images reveal the bravery, ingenuity, and human cost of those who fought wars without uniforms, often in utter secrecy. The essence of resistance was secrecy. Every action, every message, every movement carried the risk of discovery, imprisonment, or death. Photographs from these covert operations are exceptionally rare precisely because being caught with a camera, or even being photographed, could mean execution. Yet some survived, smuggled from occupied territories or hidden in private collections. These images often depict coded messages scribbled on scraps of paper, clandestine meetings in darkened basements, and operatives slipping through streets under cover of darkness. Unlike the heroic images of armies in formation, these photographs carry a tension and intimacy that reflects the constant danger surrounding every act of defiance. One of the most compelling aspects revealed in these hidden images is the ingenuity of resistance networks. In occupied France, the underground movement known as the Maquis used forest hideouts to store weapons, train operatives, and plan sabotage missions. Rare photographs show men and women camouflaging caches of explosives, practicing hand-to-hand combat, and secretly assembling leaflets to distribute to the population. In Poland, the Home Army coordinated complex urban operations, sometimes using bicycles, hidden compartments, and underground tunnels to deliver messages or smuggle supplies. These photographs capture not only the daring of the operatives but also the meticulous planning required to survive in a world under constant surveillance. Resistance was not limited to sabotage or espionage, it also encompassed acts of daily defiance. Ordinary people risked everything to hide fugitives, provide food for partisans, or maintain cultural practices banned by occupiers. Rare photographs show families concealing children in attics, neighbors exchanging secret hand signals on crowded streets, and individuals burning documents to prevent detection. One haunting image captures a young woman passing a bundle of leaflets to a courier in the shadow of a patrolling soldier, a quiet, tense act that could have ended in immediate arrest. These hidden moments reveal that resistance was woven into the fabric of everyday life, often invisible to outsiders but profoundly consequential. The human element of resistance is strikingly evident in these photographs. Faces convey fear, determination, and exhaustion simultaneously. Operatives hunch over maps under candlelight, eyes darting to the door for signs of intrusion. Others crouch behind walls, rifles or pistols at the ready, waiting for a signal. Some images capture moments of camaraderie, a fleeting smile exchanged before a dangerous mission, a reassuring hand on a shoulder. These photographs humanize the participants, reminding viewers that resistance was not a series of abstract operations but a deeply personal, perilous endeavor that demanded courage and sacrifice from ordinary people. Some of the most extraordinary rare photographs show children and teenagers participating in resistance efforts. Across occupied Europe, young couriers delivered messages, helped distribute leaflets, or observed enemy movements. One photograph depicts a group of boys hiding behind crates, scanning the street for enemy patrols while clutching folded notes. Another shows a girl guiding a wounded partisan through a narrow alley, her small frame belied by courage. These images are especially striking because they challenge assumptions about age and agency in wartime, highlighting that even the youngest members of society were drawn into the clandestine struggle for survival and freedom. Photography also reveals the stark risks inherent in resistance work. Captured operatives faced brutal punishment, including torture and execution, often intended to deter others from acting. Rare images, sometimes clandestinely preserved, show operatives being questioned under duress, their expressions a mixture of defiance and fear. Others show the aftermath of failed missions, destroyed safe houses, confiscated weapons, and grim warnings posted by occupiers. These photographs provide an unflinching view of the consequences of resistance, emphasizing that the fight was not only courageous but also extraordinarily perilous. Another striking feature of these images is the creativity employed to evade detection. Resistance members used ingenious methods for communication, transport, and concealment. In some photographs, couriers hide messages inside hollowed-out books or under coat linings. Others show operatives disguising themselves as civilians, blending into marketplaces, cafes, or trains while carrying sensitive materials. Some photographs reveal disguised weapons, from pistols hidden in umbrellas to explosives disguised as everyday items. These images underscore the constant need for adaptability and resourcefulness, highlighting that the resistance was as much a war of intelligence and improvisation as it was of courage. The photographs also illustrate the geographic and cultural diversity of resistance movements. In Italy, partisan groups fought both the occupying Germans and the remnants of Mussolini's fascist forces, often in mountainous terrain. In Yugoslavia, partisans navigated dense forests, rivers, and rural landscapes to carry out guerrilla operations. In Asia, underground movements in Burma, the Philippines, and Indonesia opposed both Japanese occupation and local collaborators. Rare photographs from these regions show operatives navigating unfamiliar terrain, forging alliances, and executing daring strategies. The images remind viewers that resistance was global, multifaceted, and deeply shaped by local circumstances. Ultimately, the rare photographs of resistance in the shadows reveal a side of World War II that was hidden from the public eye for decades. They capture acts of courage that were deliberately kept secret, risks that were rarely documented, and human resilience that defied the odds. These images remind us that the story of war is not only about the soldiers on the front lines or the decisions of governments, but also about the millions of ordinary people who quietly, courageously, and often invisibly, challenged oppression. They invite us to reconsider the narrative of the war, honoring those who fought without recognition, whose shadows continue to tell stories of bravery, sacrifice, and the unyielding human spirit. World War II is remembered not only for its battles and political maneuvers but also for the horrors it unleashed on millions of innocent lives. While history books often recount numbers and statistics, rare photographs reveal the human reality behind these atrocities, images that were suppressed, hidden, or censored because of their raw brutality. These photographs are not merely historical artifacts, they are visual testimonies of suffering, cruelty, and human resilience in the darkest corners of the conflict. Viewing them, one is confronted with the undeniable truth: war is not only fought with weapons but also with the systematic destruction of humanity. Some of the most haunting images come from concentration camps, ghettos, and labor facilities. While official photographs often sanitized life in these places, rare hidden images show the real conditions: emaciated prisoners, families torn apart, and overcrowded barracks filled with despair. One photograph captures a group of children standing silently behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow, their clothes in tatters. Another shows women washing clothes in freezing water, a mundane task made grotesquely difficult by hunger and exhaustion. These images provide a stark contrast to the sanitized propaganda images that governments attempted to disseminate at the time, emphasizing order and rehabilitation rather than suffering and death. Massacres and executions were another dimension of atrocities captured by rare cameras. In occupied Eastern Europe, many operations were conducted away from prying eyes, often in forests, fields, and remote villages. Photographs smuggled out of these regions reveal the immediate aftermath: bodies arranged in horrifying patterns, civilians bound or kneeling, soldiers with impassive expressions. One chilling image shows a line of prisoners moments before execution, their faces a mixture of fear and resignation. These photographs were dangerous to capture and preserve. Possessing them could result in death, yet they survived, hidden in private collections, attics, and archives. They now provide irrefutable visual evidence of the systematic cruelty inflicted upon millions. Beyond camps and executions, atrocities were also embedded in the daily lives of occupied populations. Hidden photographs show civilians being forced into labor under harsh conditions, often to maintain supply lines or build infrastructure for occupying forces. In some images, men carry heavy loads under guard, while children watch helplessly from nearby streets. Other photographs show civilians being publicly humiliated for minor infractions, kneeling in the snow, marked with signs, or punished in front of neighbors. These images are rarely seen in official accounts, yet they illuminate the slow, grinding terror that was as lethal in its psychological effect as the bullets and bombs on the front lines. One particularly disturbing aspect captured in rare photographs is the targeting of children. Images from the Warsaw Ghetto, Leningrad, and various occupied territories show children suffering from starvation, disease, and neglect. Some are captured in moments of quiet despair, clutching broken toys, while others are depicted being forced to work or stand in line for meager rations. These photographs are devastating precisely because they confront viewers with innocence destroyed by human cruelty. The deliberate suppression of such images at the time underscores how threatening these truths were to those in power, who wished to control public perception and maintain a veneer of legitimacy. Atrocities were not limited to one side of the conflict. While the Nazi regime's crimes are among the most infamous, Allied bombings also resulted in significant civilian casualties. Rare photographs reveal the human toll of strategic bombing campaigns on cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Tokyo. Amid flattened buildings and smoking ruins, survivors search desperately for family members, carry belongings through rubble, or tend to the wounded. These images, often overshadowed by military narratives, emphasize that the suffering of civilians was universal, regardless of which army occupied or bombed their cities. Photographs also document the psychological devastation left by atrocities. Faces frozen in shock, children clinging to parents who themselves are overwhelmed by grief, and individuals staring at destroyed homes all speak to trauma that numbers alone cannot convey. One rare image shows a man holding a charred family photograph amidst the ashes of his home, a visual symbol of loss and memory destroyed. Another shows survivors navigating piles of rubble with vacant expressions, an entire community rendered disoriented and fragile. These photographs remind us that the impact of atrocities extended far beyond immediate deaths. It reverberated through families, communities, and generations. Resistance and survival amid atrocities are also captured in hidden photographs. Some images show clandestine efforts to save lives, hidden children in attics, underground bunkers stocked with food, or makeshift medical care for those wounded or ill. In one photograph, a small group of women quietly prepares meals for children in hiding, aware that discovery could mean execution. In another, a man discreetly documents conditions in a labor camp, risking his life to preserve evidence. These images underscore the courage and resilience of those who sought to protect life in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Rare photographs of atrocities also reveal the logistical machinery behind systematic suffering. Soldiers and officials are shown organizing transports, managing work camps, or overseeing executions, their faces often calm, detached, or professional. These images are unnerving because they expose how ordinary humans can participate in cruelty when normalized by ideology, hierarchy, and circumstance. They force viewers to confront uncomfortable questions about complicity, obedience, and the capacity for cruelty, not just in history but within humanity itself. The suppression of these images was deliberate. Governments and military powers feared that revealing the extent of atrocities could provoke outrage, rebellion, or loss of support. Photographers risked their lives to capture these moments, and many images were hidden for decades. Only recently have archives released them to the public, allowing historians and audiences to witness truths once deemed too dangerous or disturbing. The photographs serve as both evidence and warning, evidence of the atrocities committed, and a warning of what can occur when power goes unchecked and humanity is devalued. In conclusion, the rare photographs of World War II atrocities offer an unflinching view of humanity's darkest chapters. They remind us that war is not only about strategy, victories, and political narratives, it is also about human suffering, moral choices, and the consequences of ideology and indifference. Each photograph is a testament to those who endured unimaginable horrors, to the courage of those who resisted, and to the silent voices that history often overlooked. By confronting these images, we gain a deeper, more honest understanding of the war, one that balances heroism with horror, and triumph with tragedy. Amid the horror and hardship of World War II, there existed a peculiar layer of the conflict, moments so strange, unexpected, or absurd that they almost defy belief. These were the instances where ordinary rules of war, society, and reason seemed suspended, captured in rare photographs that survived against all odds. While propaganda rarely highlighted such moments, and official histories often overlooked them, these images provide a fascinating glimpse into the surreal side of wartime life, a world where reality and absurdity collided in the most unexpected ways. One of the most striking examples of wartime surrealism is the improvised adaptation of everyday objects into tools of survival or defense. Rare photographs show soldiers fashioning weapons out of household items, turning bicycles into reconnaissance vehicles, or transforming abandoned carts into makeshift transport. In one image, a soldier balances precariously on a barrel to maintain surveillance over enemy territory, a scene that might appear comedic in isolation but underscores the improvisational ingenuity demanded by war. These photographs capture the tension between necessity and creativity, revealing how human beings adapt even in the direst circumstances. Animals also play a surprisingly prominent role in some of the war's bizarre and surreal moments. Pigeons were used as messengers, dogs trained for detection or rescue, and even cats sometimes found themselves in military operations. Rare photographs depict pigeons in miniature harnesses, dogs navigating obstacle courses, and soldiers interacting with their animal companions amidst ruins. One photograph shows a dog patrolling alongside troops, while a cat wanders nonchalantly through a battlefield scene. These images are striking because they juxtapose innocence, playfulness, and routine life with the devastation and seriousness of war, highlighting the dissonance inherent in human and animal experiences in conflict zones. Occasionally, war created absurd juxtapositions that could not be staged or anticipated. One rare photograph shows children playing soccer in a cratered street, ignoring the distant sounds of artillery. In another, soldiers relax in a makeshift cafe inside a bombed-out building, sipping tea amid collapsed walls and debris. These moments reveal the resilience of the human spirit and the desire to maintain routines, even when surrounded by chaos. They also highlight the contradictions of wartime life, leisure, laughter, and play coexisting with fear, destruction, and death. propaganda itself sometimes contributed to surreal moments. Governments staged elaborate ceremonies, performances, and demonstrations designed to inspire morale or intimidate the enemy. Rare photographs capture scenes that today seem almost theatrical, soldiers forming intricate formations that appear more like choreography than military precision, parades featuring unusual floats or symbols, and children handed weapons for ceremonial photographs. While intended to convey order, strength, or unity, these images often appear odd, even comical, when examined in historical hindsight. They reveal a side of wartime messaging where image and spectacle took precedence over reality. Transportation and mobility also produced unusual visual moments. Soldiers and civilians adapted vehicles to extraordinary circumstances, bicycles carrying entire families, carts hauling supplies through destroyed streets, and overloaded trucks precariously balancing cargo and people. One photograph shows a soldier attempting to push a jeep through deep mud while fellow troops cling to the sides for balance. Another depicts a train car stuffed beyond capacity, passengers teetering on the edges. These images convey both the ingenuity and absurdity that arose from logistical challenges, showing that survival often demanded improvisation that bordered on the surreal. The intersection of war and pop culture also occasionally created bizarre scenes. Soldiers sometimes painted murals, drew cartoons, or staged small theatrical performances in quiet moments, and rare photographs of these activities have survived. One image shows a group of soldiers dressed in makeshift costumes performing a play for comrades, another depicts graffiti humorously criticizing leadership scrawled on a ruined wall. These moments are striking because they illustrate the human need for expression, levity, and commentary, even in the darkest and most dangerous circumstances. Unexpected natural phenomena also contributed to surreal wartime photography. Smoke, fire, fog, and unusual weather could transform ordinary landscapes into scenes resembling fantasy or nightmares. Rare photographs capture these effects: shattered cities shrouded in mist, sunlight filtering through smoke over battlefields, or snow blanketing destroyed villages in an eerie calm. When combined with human activity, soldiers marching, civilians scavenging, or vehicles moving through debris, these images create a dissonant visual effect that is both beautiful and unsettling. They remind us that war was not only fought among people but also witnessed and shaped by the natural world. Finally, some of the most surreal photographs capture moments of absurd irony. Soldiers posing for celebratory pictures in front of demolished homes, civilians smiling for the camera while chaos rages behind them, and makeshift decorations erected amidst destruction all reveal a world where human beings sought to assert control, humor, or normalcy despite surrounding catastrophe. These images are invaluable because they highlight the contradictions of life during war: resilience alongside fragility, playfulness alongside fear, absurdity alongside tragedy. By examining these bizarre and surreal moments, we gain insight into the unpredictability and complexity of human behavior in extreme conditions. They remind us that war is not a monolithic experience of suffering and discipline, it is also a space where improvisation, humor, absurdity, and human resilience intersect in unexpected ways. These rare photographs allow us to glimpse the strange, sometimes incongruous realities of World War II, a world where devastation coexisted with inventiveness, fear coexisted with joy, and absurdity emerged in the shadows of destruction. History often remembers the generals, the admirals, and the political leaders who shaped World War II, but behind every major victory and every pivotal moment were countless ordinary individuals whose courage went unrecorded in mainstream accounts. These were the men and women who acted without fanfare, who performed small yet essential acts of bravery, and whose stories were captured only in rare photographs, images that quietly preserve their heroism, often hidden for decades. It is through these photographs that we can witness the profound impact of ordinary heroes during one of humanity's darkest chapters. One category of hidden heroes was the medics and nurses who worked tirelessly under extreme conditions. Rare photographs show women and men administering first aid on battlefields, tending to the wounded in bombed-out buildings, or improvising medical supplies in makeshift hospitals. One photograph captures a nurse carefully bandaging a soldier's arm under dim candlelight, her expression a mixture of focus and fatigue. Another shows medics transporting injured civilians through rubble-strewn streets, balancing urgency with compassion. These images remind us that heroism is not always loud or public, sometimes it exists in quiet, determined acts of care and life-saving intervention. Civilian bravery also features prominently in these rare photographs. Ordinary men and women risked imprisonment, torture, or death to protect others. In one image, a family conceals a group of children in an attic, their faces tense but determined, knowing that discovery could mean execution. Another photograph shows a woman smuggling food and medicine to partisans hiding in forests, her steps careful and calculated to avoid patrols. These images highlight the courage inherent in everyday choices, acts that required moral conviction, resourcefulness, and the willingness to face unimaginable danger for the sake of others. Hidden photographs also document the heroism of factory workers, engineers, and scientists who contributed to the war effort in non-combat roles. In one image, women labor tirelessly in an armaments factory, constructing ammunition under strict quotas and grueling conditions, their faces marked by exhaustion yet determination. Another shows engineers inspecting machinery for weapons production, their work precise, their stakes high. While these individuals were far from the battlefield, their efforts were critical to sustaining armies and operations, and these rare images capture the quiet heroism of industrious, skilled labor in wartime. Underground operatives and spies also emerge as ordinary heroes through these hidden images. Resistance movements relied on everyday people to carry messages, sabotage enemy operations, and gather intelligence. A photograph shows a young courier crouched in shadow, passing vital documents to a contact, eyes alert to the slightest sound. Another captures a group of operatives hiding weapons in a forest clearing, their actions meticulous and perilous. These images reveal the extraordinary risks ordinary people took, performing tasks that required courage, intelligence, and unwavering dedication, often without recognition or reward. Teachers, librarians, and cultural preservers were among the most understated heroes, yet their contributions were profound. In occupied territories, many risked punishment to protect books, artworks, and historical records from destruction. Rare photographs reveal teachers hiding children's artwork from authorities, librarians moving valuable texts to safe locations, and curators documenting stolen cultural artifacts. These acts of preservation may not have changed battle outcomes, but they safeguarded the intellectual and cultural memory of nations. The photographs serve as a reminder that heroism often manifests in protecting ideas, knowledge, and identity as fiercely as lives themselves. Children themselves sometimes played roles as unexpected heroes. Rare photographs show young couriers navigating streets under watchful enemy eyes, delivering messages that could alter the course of resistance operations. In one image, a group of children carries a small cache of medicine and food to hidden partisans, their expressions a mixture of fear, determination, and resilience. These images challenge conventional notions of agency and heroism, illustrating that courage was not determined by age or rank but by action and intent. Even in the smallest bodies, extraordinary bravery could be found. Some photographs capture the intersection of humor and courage, a coping mechanism that helped ordinary heroes survive. Soldiers hiding civilians, families protecting children, or operatives slipping past checkpoints often had to mask fear with composure or even levity. One rare image shows a group of resistance members grinning beneath masks of tension as they prepare a daring mission, their expressions a mixture of camaraderie and nerves. These moments reveal the human dimension of bravery. Humor and morale were tools of survival as much as stealth and skill. The risks undertaken by ordinary heroes were immense. Being caught often meant torture or death, and yet these individuals persisted. Rare photographs depict the consequences of exposure, abandoned hideouts, confiscated supplies, and the aftermath of raids. These images convey the stakes of heroism in stark terms, reminding viewers that courage was not an abstract ideal, it was a daily negotiation with danger, fear, and mortality. Each photograph is a visual testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the extraordinary lengths ordinary people went to preserve life, dignity, and hope. Importantly, these photographs also humanize the war's untold narratives. Ordinary heroes were not flawless, they experienced fear, doubt, and exhaustion. Many photographs capture moments of vulnerability, a nurse wiping tears from her face after losing a patient, a courier pausing to rest in the forest after a dangerous run, a factory worker slumping in fatigue after a 16-hour shift. These images remind us that heroism is inseparable from humanity, it exists alongside fear, vulnerability, and perseverance. It is in these complex, authentic moments that the true essence of courage is revealed. By examining the rare photographs of ordinary heroes, we gain a deeper understanding of World War II as more than a story of armies and generals. It becomes a story of countless individuals, often anonymous, who acted with bravery, compassion, and ingenuity in situations that tested the limits of human endurance. These images preserve the legacy of people whose deeds were too subtle, too dangerous, or too quiet to be recognized in their time, ensuring that their courage is not forgotten. They remind us that in the shadows of history, ordinary people can perform extraordinary acts, leaving behind a visual record of resilience, morality, and humanity in the face of overwhelming darkness. While much of World War II history focuses on battles, politics, and atrocities, rare photographs reveal a different dimension of the era, the culture, rituals, and everyday life of people living through unprecedented turmoil. These images capture fleeting moments of humanity, creativity, and resilience amid destruction, snapshots that show how ordinary people clung to traditions, maintained social bonds, and found beauty in small gestures. They offer a window into the lived experience of war beyond the headlines, documenting a world that was constantly adapting, surviving, and preserving its identity. One of the most striking themes in these rare photographs is the persistence of daily life. Despite the chaos, civilians continued to cook, shop, and socialize. One photograph captures a market scene in a partially bombed city, where women haggle over vegetables while children play nearby. The juxtaposition is striking, the resilience of routine against the backdrop of destruction. Another image shows a family gathering around a modest meal in a dimly lit kitchen, faces illuminated by candlelight. These cultural snapshots remind us that even in war, life went on, people sought normalcy wherever possible, and their everyday acts became small acts of resistance against fear and despair. Festivals, holidays, and religious ceremonies also survived amid the conflict, often in hidden or improvised forms. Rare photographs reveal clandestine gatherings, improvised celebrations, and makeshift decorations. In one image, children wear handmade costumes for a festival in a bombed-out town square, laughter captured despite the surrounding ruins. Another photograph shows villagers secretly celebrating a religious holiday in a forest clearing, their candles casting shadows on the trees. These images underscore the human need for ritual and community, highlighting that cultural identity persisted even when political and military forces sought to dominate every aspect of life. Music, theater, and performance were also vital elements of cultural resilience. Soldiers and civilians alike used art as both entertainment and psychological escape. Rare photographs depict impromptu concerts in shelters, secret theater performances, and street musicians playing for small audiences. One photograph captures a violinist playing amidst rubble while neighbors listen in silence, the contrast between devastation and artistry starkly evident. These images remind viewers that culture is not merely decorative, it is a tool for survival, a way to maintain morale, and a subtle form of defiance against oppression. Clothing and fashion provide another fascinating lens into wartime culture. Despite shortages and rationing, people adapted creatively. Photographs show civilians wearing patched clothing, uniforms repurposed into everyday wear, and handmade accessories reflecting local traditions. One rare image depicts a young woman sewing a dress from scraps of fabric while an air raid siren blares outside. Another captures men sporting improvised hats or insignia, blending necessity with personal expression. These images offer a visual narrative of adaptation, resilience, and creativity, demonstrating that cultural expression persisted even when resources were scarce and survival was precarious. Street life and public spaces also reveal cultural adaptation. Rare photographs capture cafes, public squares, and transport hubs filled with ordinary life. In one image, children play hopscotch on cracked pavement while adults carry water or forage for supplies. Another shows a street musician entertaining passers-by, a small pocket of normalcy amid disruption. These photographs highlight the tension between destruction and continuity. Even as cities were damaged and populations displaced, people found ways to occupy public spaces, maintain routines, and preserve a sense of community. Education and learning were not entirely halted either. Hidden photographs reveal clandestine classrooms, tutors instructing small groups of children, and students carrying books through rubble. One image shows a teacher using chalk on a wall as a blackboard in a makeshift classroom, while the children sit on broken benches or crates. These cultural snapshots illustrate that intellectual life and the desire to learn persisted even in extreme adversity. They are a testament to human determination to maintain knowledge, structure, and hope for future generations. Family life, too, persisted under extraordinary conditions. Photographs show parents comforting children, families celebrating birthdays, or siblings helping each other navigate the hardships of war. One image captures a mother braiding her child's hair while rubble surrounds the home, a quiet act of normalcy and love. Another shows children playing a game of catch in a bombed-out playground, laughter captured in defiance of fear. These images are invaluable because they document resilience, love, and continuity in a world constantly disrupted by violence and uncertainty. Finally, rare cultural photographs reveal the interplay between tradition and adaptation. People found ways to preserve rituals, language, and customs while also improvising with the resources at hand. Festivals, meals, music, and games were adapted to fit new realities, reflecting both ingenuity and the enduring human spirit. These images remind us that culture is not static, it is lived, adapted, and preserved even under extraordinary pressure. They allow viewers to see the humanity behind the war, offering hope, beauty, and insight into how communities endured through one of the most challenging periods in modern history. By examining these rare cultural snapshots, we gain a richer understanding of World War II beyond strategy, battles, and politics. They document the resilience of ordinary people, the preservation of identity, and the creativity that flourished even in adversity. Each photograph captures a fleeting moment of normalcy, defiance, or joy, offering a counterpoint to the destruction and despair commonly associated with the war. Through these images, history becomes not just a record of conflict, but a vivid story of human persistence, adaptation, and cultural survival. As the guns fell silent and nations began the slow, painful process of rebuilding, the true impact of World War II continued to resonate, not only in infrastructure and politics but in the collective memory captured by rare, often overlooked photographs. These images provide a window into the long-term consequences of the conflict, the physical devastation, the cultural shifts, the personal losses, and the small acts of resilience that shaped the post-war world. Unlike staged propaganda or widely circulated press photographs, these rare images preserve the authenticity of recovery, documenting moments that reveal the enduring human and societal legacy of war. One prominent theme in these photographs is the reconstruction of cities and communities. Rare images depict civilians clearing rubble, rebuilding homes, and restoring public spaces in bombed-out towns across Europe and Asia. One photograph shows workers lifting bricks onto a half-collapsed wall while children play nearby, capturing the simultaneous chaos and hope of reconstruction. Another image captures families returning to partially restored neighborhoods, their expressions a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and determination. These images remind us that rebuilding after war was not only a logistical challenge but also an emotional journey, as communities struggled to regain normalcy amid lingering trauma. Cultural preservation and revival also emerge prominently in these rare photographs. Museums, libraries, and schools, many of which had been destroyed or looted, began the painstaking process of recovery. Photographs reveal archivists cataloging salvaged books, curators restoring damaged artworks, and teachers reopening classrooms in improvised spaces. In one image, a group of children is seen reading under the guidance of a teacher in a makeshift library, surrounded by the remnants of what had been lost. These images demonstrate the resilience of human culture and the determination to reclaim and protect knowledge, even after catastrophic disruption. Personal recovery and family reunions are another significant aspect of the post-war legacy. Rare photographs capture emotional reunions between soldiers and their families, children finding lost relatives, and communities mourning those who never returned. One image depicts a soldier embracing his mother, tears streaming down both their faces, with the ruins of a city in the background. Another shows a group of children, once evacuated or hidden, cautiously returning to their homes. These photographs remind viewers that while the war ended on paper, the human process of healing and reconnection was complex, prolonged, and emotionally charged. Survivors of atrocities are also central to these photographs, often shown navigating life in a world still shadowed by trauma. Images of former concentration camp prisoners being liberated reveal both relief and the daunting challenges ahead: emaciated bodies, destroyed homes, and uncertain futures. Rare photographs capture the delicate moments of first steps back into freedom, medical recovery, and attempts to reconnect with lost family and friends. These visual narratives convey the enormous resilience required to rebuild identity, community, and trust after enduring unimaginable suffering. The photographs also document shifts in societal roles and gender dynamics that emerged from the war. Women who had taken on jobs in factories, military support, and administrative roles during the conflict were now navigating a changing social landscape. Rare images depict women supervising construction projects, running businesses, or caring for communities in the immediate post-war period. These images reflect a subtle but lasting transformation. The war forced societies to adapt, creating opportunities for women to demonstrate skill, leadership, and resilience, and the photographs preserve these pivotal moments of social change. Economic recovery and resourcefulness are also evident in the images. Civilians salvaging materials, farmers tending to fields, and merchants reopening shops all provide a glimpse into the immense effort required to revive economies disrupted by years of conflict. One photograph shows a man repairing a bicycle using parts scavenged from destroyed vehicles, while another captures a market scene bustling with trade in a partially rebuilt town. These images highlight human ingenuity in the face of scarcity, showing that recovery was as much about creativity and adaptation as it was about resources and labor. Education, art, and sports re-emerged as vital elements of post-war life, symbolizing hope and continuity. Rare photographs reveal children returning to schools, local sports matches resuming, and theatrical performances staged amidst rubble. In one image, children are seen playing soccer in a cratered field, laughter and energy defying the destruction surrounding them. Another shows a community theater group rehearsing in a partially destroyed hall. These photographs emphasize that human beings naturally seek connection, play, and creative expression, even after the trauma of war, and that these activities were essential for rebuilding the social fabric. Finally, rare post-war photographs capture moments of reflection, memory, and commemoration. Monuments were erected, memorial ceremonies held, and families gathered to honor the dead. Some images show survivors visiting graves, laying flowers, or observing moments of silence in bombed-out squares. Others capture ordinary citizens pausing to photograph ruins or document stories for future generations. These photographs serve as visual records of collective memory, illustrating how societies sought to process the past while simultaneously planning for a future shaped by both loss and hope. By examining these rare photographs of the post-war legacy, we gain a profound understanding of the war's enduring impact. They document the resilience of individuals and communities, the restoration of culture and knowledge, the transformation of societal roles, and the ways people preserved memory and identity amidst reconstruction. These images remind us that World War II did not end with surrender alone. Its human, cultural, and societal consequences continued to shape lives for decades. They allow us to witness recovery, adaptation, and the persistent human spirit, providing a visual narrative of hope, perseverance, and the long-lasting legacy of a world forever changed by conflict. To truly understand life inside a medieval castle, we need to climb higher than the drafty kitchens and muddy courtyards, up into the chambers of power. Because while the stone walls projected strength to the outside world, what really sustained the castle's dominance was the rigid hierarchy within, an invisible ladder of privilege and duty, headed by the lord and lady of the estate. The lord was not merely the owner of the castle. He was its heartbeat, its judge, and its symbol of authority. His word was law within those walls, and often across the lands beyond them. To peasants, he was the figure whose decisions determined whether they could marry, farm certain fields, or even survive a famine. To knights and soldiers, he was commander and paymaster. To his family, he was both protector and master. Every stone of the castle was ultimately tied to his name and his reputation. But being a lord was no easy privilege. He bore responsibilities that were as exhausting as they were dangerous. At any moment, disputes between neighbors, uprisings from peasants, or threats from rival nobles could demand swift action. The lord was expected to maintain not only military readiness but also economic stability. He needed to ensure the fields produced, taxes were collected, justice was dispensed, and the castle remained a formidable fortress. His life was less about leisurely feasts and more about endless duties. Daily routine for a lord often began with petitions. Subjects, knights, merchants, and even priests would line up to plead their cases. Disputes over land boundaries, unpaid debts, accusations of theft, these matters came to the lord's attention, and he was expected to render judgment. In many ways, he functioned as both a landlord and a judge, making decisions that could change lives in an instant. Justice in a castle was swift and rarely merciful, a reflection of the lord's authority and the harsh realities of the age. While the lord wielded power in public, much of the castle's internal management fell to the lady. Too often, history has painted medieval noblewomen as passive figures, but inside the castle, the lady's role was vital. She was the overseer of the household, responsible for ensuring that servants worked efficiently, storerooms were stocked, and meals were prepared for dozens or even hundreds of mouths. Her authority reached into every chamber, from the buttery to the great hall. When the lord was absent, which was often, due to wars, hunts, or political travel, the lady effectively became the ruler of the castle. She might oversee finances, negotiate with tenants, or even organize the defense of the fortress. There are recorded cases of noblewomen personally commanding garrisons during sieges, proving that behind the curtains of medieval hierarchy, female power was real and significant. Yet this authority came at a cost: immense pressure, constant scrutiny, and the knowledge that any misstep could damage the family standing. Marriage, for both lords and ladies, was rarely about love. It was about power. Castles themselves were often symbols of dynastic unions, built or expanded to seal alliances between families. A noble marriage might secure peace between rivals, gain new lands, or strengthen claims to titles. The individuals at the center of such arrangements had little choice. Children as young as 12 or 13 could find themselves bound in matrimony, their futures decided by strategies of inheritance and politics. Behind these alliances, however, life in the upper chambers of the castle could be lonely. For a lady married into a foreign household, isolation was common. Surrounded by unfamiliar servants, cut off from childhood friends, she often relied heavily on personal maids or confessors for companionship. For the lord, the weight of political ambition left little room for domestic affection. While romance existed, sometimes in secret, it was often overshadowed by duty. The hierarchy inside the castle extended beyond the ruling family. The Great Hall was a stage where status was displayed with precision. The lord sat at the high table, elevated above everyone else, while retainers, knights, and guests were placed in descending order of importance. Even the arrangement of dishes and the serving of food reflected one's rank. A visitor's position at the table could be both an honor and a message, friendship, alliance, or humiliation made visible for all to see. Yet, beneath this outward display of harmony, the castle was riddled with intrigue. Courtiers whispered, knights schemed for favor, and rivals waited for any sign of weakness. A careless word in the wrong ear could spark a feud. A misjudged decision could cost loyalty. Even within the family, tensions brewed, brothers fought over inheritance, daughters resisted arranged marriages, and lords feared betrayal from within their own bloodline. The higher you climbed in the hierarchy, the more perilous your position became. For those at the bottom, however, the lord and lady appeared untouchable. Their chambers, often placed in the upper stories of the keep, were like sanctuaries above the daily grind. Rich fabrics adorned their beds, carved chests held treasures, and private chapels allowed for solitary prayer. Compared to the straw pallets of servants, these luxuries seemed otherworldly. Yet even here, comfort was relative. Rooms were still cold, candles were scarce, and privacy was almost non-existent. The real power of the lord and lady wasn't measured in silks or jewels but in control, over people, over resources, and over the rhythms of life itself. Their authority determined when the castle feasted, when it fought, and when it prayed. Every inhabitant, from the youngest kitchen boy to the oldest knight, moved in orbit around their will. The castle may have been made of stone, but its living order was shaped by human ambition, fear, and loyalty. In the end, stepping into the chambers of the ruling family revealed the central truth of medieval hierarchy: castles were not only fortresses of stone but fortresses of power. Every wall, every hall, every chamber reinforced who ruled and who obeyed. To live inside a castle was to live inside a pyramid of authority, with the lord and lady at its pinnacle, bearing both the privilege and the crushing weight of their position. And just beneath them, ready to serve, to fight, and to uphold the code of loyalty, stood the knights and soldiers, the enforcers of the castle's order. When people today hear the word knight, they often picture a glittering hero from legend, rescuing damsels, dueling dragons, and upholding chivalry with shining armor. But the truth of what knights and soldiers really did inside a medieval castle was far more complicated, and often far darker. Behind the polished myth lay the reality of men who were warriors, enforcers, and sometimes ruthless killers. The knight was, at his core, a professional fighter. His life revolved around war, training for war, or preparing others for war. From a young age, boys destined for knighthood were sent away from their families to serve as pages in another noble household. At first, their duties were menial, carrying messages, cleaning armor, tending horses. But all of it was designed to instill discipline, loyalty, and the beginnings of martial skill. By adolescence, they rose to the rank of squire, serving a knight directly. This meant long days of maintaining armor, sharpening weapons, and standing at the edge of tournaments, waiting to rush in if their master was unhorsed. It was here that they learned not only the arts of combat but also the strict social codes that governed knightly life. A squire who proved himself brave, loyal, and skilled could eventually earn the ceremonial dubbing that transformed him into a knight. Inside the castle, knights were more than just warriors. They were the visible arm of the lord's authority. They patrolled the walls, enforced the lord's justice, and kept order among the garrison. To servants and peasants, knights were intimidating figures in mail or plate, reminders of the power they served. For all the talk of honor, knights could be brutal. They were expected to crush revolts, intimidate rivals, and, if needed, spill blood without hesitation. Their loyalty was pledged not to lofty ideals, but to their lord. Daily life for a knight was filled with routine discipline. Training was constant, practicing with sword, lance, and bow, drilling in formation, and riding endlessly to perfect horsemanship. A knight's armor alone required practice to master. Chainmail weighed dozens of pounds, while later plate armor demanded strength and endurance to fight ineffectively. Despite popular belief, knights were not clumsy in armor, but moving, fighting, and surviving in it took relentless conditioning. Tournaments provided a rare chance to display skill publicly. But these events, often romanticized today, were violent affairs. Justs could leave men with shattered bones, crushed chests, or even dead on the field. Melee battles were even more chaotic, mass skirmishes that resembled real warfare, fought not only for glory but for ransom. Capturing an enemy knight could mean profit, since noble families were expected to pay dearly to win back their kin. Tournaments were part sport, part training, part deadly gamble. Beneath the knights stood the common soldiers, the footmen, archers, and guards who formed the backbone of the castle's defense. These men lacked the glamour of knighthood but bore much of the burden of daily military labor. They guarded the walls through freezing nights, drilled with spears and crossbows, and manned the gates against intruders. Life as a soldier in a castle was harsh and monotonous, endless watch shifts, poor rations, and constant readiness for a conflict that might never come. The relationship between knights and soldiers was uneasy. Knights saw themselves as a superior warrior class, bound by noble lineage and training. Soldiers were often hired men, sometimes mercenaries, sometimes peasants pressed into service. Yet in times of siege or battle, both stood shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same dangers. A boiling cauldron of pitch or a hail of arrows did not distinguish between noble knight and common footman. The famous code of chivalry that people associate with knights was less about romance and more about control. It encouraged loyalty to one's lord, defense of the faith, and protection of the weak, but in practice, these ideals were flexible. Knights could be ruthless in war, plundering villages, killing peasants, or breaking oaths if it suited their interests. Chronicles are filled with examples of knights abandoning lofty codes for political gain or sheer survival. Chivalry was as much a public performance as it was a way of life. Religion also played a role in shaping the knightly identity. Many knights saw themselves as soldiers of God, especially during the Crusades. In castles, chaplains reminded them that their duty was not only to their lord but to their faith. Confession, prayer before battle, and donations to the church helped knights reconcile the violence of their profession with the demands of Christian morality. Whether this eased their consciences is another matter entirely. For all their discipline, knights lived in a world of constant tension. Rivalries between lords could pull them into sudden wars. Shifting allegiances meant today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy. Even within the castle walls, knights competed fiercely for favor, land, or marriage prospects. A careless insult at a feast might end in a duel. Honor was fragile, and reputation could make or break a knight's fortunes. But perhaps the most important role knights played inside a castle was psychological. Their presence projected power. A guest arriving at a castle and seeing armored men drilling in the courtyard knew instantly that violence was always an option. For servants and peasants, knights symbolized the lord's ability to enforce obedience. For enemies, they were a deterrent, the human embodiment of the fortress's strength. The castle was not only a structure of stone but also of steel, discipline, and intimidation, and knights were the ones who made that reality visible. Still, behind the glint of armor and the thunder of hooves, knights were human. They ate, drank, quarreled, and laughed like anyone else. They suffered from wounds that never fully healed, endured crushing fatigue from campaigns, and carried the trauma of brutal battles. Many knights did not live to old age, cut down in war or disease before reaching their prime. The myth of the invincible knight was powerful, but the truth was that life as a warrior was short, dangerous, and fraught with uncertainty. In the end, the castle's strength depended not just on walls of stone, but on the men who defended it. Knights and soldiers alike formed the living shield of their lord's power, the enforcers of justice, and the guardians of order. Without them, the grand halls and towering keeps would have been little more than empty shells. And yet, for all their importance, knights and soldiers were not the ones who kept the castle alive day after day. That burden fell on a very different group of people, the servants and peasants whose endless labor made life within the fortress even possible. If the lord, lady, knights, and soldiers formed the visible face of a medieval castle, its invisible strength, the true engine that kept the fortress alive, was the labor of servants and peasants. Their work rarely makes it into the romantic legends, but without them, the castle would have collapsed into chaos. For every glittering banquet in the great hall, there were dozens of hands preparing, cleaning, and hauling. For every battle fought at the gates, there were peasants who had carried stones, cut timber, or cooked meals that made survival possible. Entering the world of a servant inside a medieval castle was to enter a cycle of ceaseless toil. The hierarchy of service was as strict as that of nobility. At the very top were senior officials, stewards, bailiffs, and chamberlains, trusted men who managed accounts, distributed supplies, and oversaw discipline. Below them, countless household servants filled specialized roles: cooks, scullions, grooms, laundresses, maids, falconers, stable boys, and more. Each had a task, and each knew their place. The castle kitchen was perhaps the busiest and noisiest place of all. Fires roared in massive hearths, spits turned endlessly with roasting meats, and the clang of pots echoed off the stone. At the lowest rung of this world was the spit boy, often just a child, who spent hours slowly turning a roasting rod by hand, sweat and smoke stinging his eyes. Above him, cooks orchestrated meals for dozens, sometimes hundreds, depending on the size of the household. They not only prepared food but also managed storage, monitored supplies, and improvised when shortages arose. Mistakes could mean the wrath of both the lord and the hungry garrison. Elsewhere, maids scrubbed floors covered with rushes, a mixture of straw and herbs meant to mask the stench of daily life. These rushes quickly absorbed grease, spilled ale, and worse, and they had to be replaced frequently. Servants also tended to fires, carried water from wells, laundered clothes in icy streams, and cleaned chamber pots from noble chambers. It was grueling work, often thankless, but it kept the illusion of order intact. The stable yard was another hub of constant motion. Horses were the engines of medieval power, essential for knights, hunting, travel, and war. Grooms and stable boys fed, brushed, and mucked stalls, often rising before dawn. A knight's horse was as valuable as any piece of armor, and neglecting it could bring severe punishment. Servants who cared for these animals bore responsibility far beyond their station. Life for peasants connected to the castle was equally demanding. Many were not permanent residents but were summoned when needed, especially during building projects, harvest times, or when war threatened. The construction of a castle itself was often carried out by peasant labor, whether hauling limestone blocks, cutting timber for scaffolding, or digging moats. These men and women worked long hours for little reward, driven by obligation to their lord's authority. For peasants drawn into castle service during festivals or military campaigns, the experience was overwhelming. Inside the walls, they faced strict discipline and alien routines. They might be assigned to haul barrels of ale, serve trenchers of food during feasts, or repair defenses. Many of them had never before encountered the noise, hierarchy, and constant surveillance of castle life. Returning home, they often carried stories of awe mixed with exhaustion. The contrast between noble luxury and servant hardship was starkest during banquets. While the lord, lady, and honored guests sat at the high table enjoying roasted swan, spiced wine, and elaborate pies, the servants darted about carrying trays, refilling cups, and cleaning spills. Few ever tasted the delicacies they prepared. Their meals were simpler: bread, pottage, ale, sometimes scraps from the feast if fortune allowed. The gap between upstairs and downstairs was not only visible but edible. And yet, servants were not simply invisible tools. They were the eyes and ears of the castle. A maid cleaning chambers overheard conversations. A steward controlling the storerooms knew exactly how much wealth passed through the gates. A falconer entrusted with the lord's prized birds could wield surprising influence. Servants walked in the shadows, but their presence was everywhere. Some used that presence to their advantage, trading information or currying favor in subtle ways. The risks of service were many. Accidents with fire, heavy loads, or animals were common. Disease spread quickly in crowded quarters. Punishments for mistakes could be severe, ranging from beatings to dismissal. Yet, service also offered opportunity. A clever or loyal servant might rise in station, entrusted with greater responsibilities. Some even gained enough favor to secure small plots of land or marriage into better circumstances. For children born into servant families, the castle was their world. They learned tasks from a young age, fetching water, sweeping floors, carrying messages. Childhood as we understand it today hardly existed. They were expected to work as soon as they could walk steadily and speak clearly. Their games, when they had time, were shaped by the castle itself: mock sword fights in the courtyards, hide-and-seek among barrels in the storeroom. To the noble family, servants and peasants were often invisible until something went wrong. A feast delayed, a horse neglected, a chamber pot forgotten, only then did the lords notice, and often with harsh words. But to one another, servants formed their own community. In shared quarters, over shared meals, they forged friendships, whispered complaints, and told stories. They lived in the shadows of power, but they carried their own small joys and sorrows. Ultimately, the castle was a stage, and every grand performance of power, every feast, every council, every display of wealth, relied on the unseen labor behind the curtain. Lords and ladies could not have ruled without knights, and knights could not have fought without food, clothing, and equipment prepared by countless hands. The peasants in the fields and the servants in the halls were the true backbone of castle life. For them, the castle was not a symbol of romance or grandeur. It was a workplace, a master's house, sometimes even a prison of duty. They endured long hours, harsh treatment, and constant demands, not because they chose it, but because the hierarchy of their world left them little choice. And still, day after day, they kept the fires burning, the horses fed, the walls repaired, and the castle alive. As we move from the labor of servants into the grand spectacles of the castle, we see another side of medieval life, the dazzling feasts that proclaimed wealth and power. But behind every banquet's glittering facade was sweat, smoke, and endless toil. If the heart of a medieval castle was its great hall, then its stomach was the kitchen. And like any stomach, it was never still. From dawn until deep into the night, smoke curled from the kitchen chimneys, pots boiled over roaring fires, and servants scurried through stone corridors carrying trays of food, jugs of ale, and baskets of bread. To keep a castle alive was to keep it fed, and the kitchen was the engine that powered this daily ritual of survival and spectacle. The scale of castle kitchens was enormous. Feeding a household of dozens, sometimes hundreds, was no small task. A single feast for visiting nobles might demand whole herds of livestock, dozens of barrels of ale, and carts full of bread. Even on ordinary days, the kitchen had to prepare meals for the lord and lady, their family, the knights and soldiers stationed in the castle, and the countless servants who labored behind the scenes. The smell of roasting meat and simmering stews was constant, but so was the sweat and exhaustion of those who made it possible. At the lowest rung were the kitchen boys, children assigned to fetch water, carry firewood, or turn the spits where whole animals roasted. It was dangerous work. Flames, sharp knives, and boiling cauldrons meant that burns and cuts were common. Above them, scullions scrubbed greasy pots until their hands cracked and bled. Slightly higher in rank were bakers, brewers, and butchers, each working in separate quarters to keep supplies moving. At the top stood the master cook, a figure of both skill and authority, responsible for planning meals, managing stores, and ensuring that the lord's table reflected his wealth and power. The logistics were staggering. Bread was the cornerstone of every meal, baked in vast ovens that required constant stoking. Beer and ale were brewed daily, since water was often unsafe to drink. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried to keep it edible, while spices, imported at great cost, were measured carefully, for they were both flavor and status symbol. Pepper, cinnamon, and saffron were more than seasonings. They were a declaration that this was no ordinary household but a seat of prestige. All of this effort reached its climax in the Great Hall, where meals became performances of power. The hall was more than a dining room, it was the stage on which the lord displayed his wealth, authority, and hospitality. Long wooden tables were laid out, covered with trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that served as edible plates. Candles flickered in iron chandeliers overhead, tapestries muted the echo of stone walls, and heraldic banners reminded guests of the lineage and honor of their host. When the feast began, it was a spectacle for the senses. Minstrels played lutes and harps, jesters performed tricks, and the smell of roasted boar or venison filled the hall. Servants hurried in lines, balancing platters of roasted swans adorned with their feathers, pies filled with spiced fruits, and steaming cauldrons of stew. Ale and wine flowed freely, poured into goblets that clinked as guests toasted their host. To be invited to such a feast was to be reminded of where true power resided. But beneath the pageantry lay harsher truths. Food hygiene was often poor, and spoiled meat was sometimes masked with heavy spices. Medical accounts suggest that food poisoning was not uncommon. Rats and insects could infest storerooms, and servants handling food rarely had the means to stay clean. For the nobles at the high table, meals were indulgent and excessive, but for the workers in the kitchens, they were grueling marathons of heat, smoke, and pressure. Even the very structure of the meal reflected hierarchy. Nobles and honored guests ate the finest cuts, delicately spiced dishes, and exotic fruits. Lower-ranking retainers were served simpler fare, often boiled meats or pottages. Servants at the bottom rarely ate during the feast itself. Instead, they might be given leftovers afterward, sometimes the trenchers themselves soaked with gravy and grease. Food reinforced social order just as surely as armor or titles. Feasts were not merely for pleasure, they were tools of politics. Hosting a lavish banquet impressed allies, intimidated rivals, and displayed a lord's ability to command resources. During times of peace, feasts cemented bonds of loyalty. During times of tension, they were subtle warnings: look how much wealth we command, look how many retainers gather under our roof. The castle kitchen, in that sense, was as important to diplomacy as the armory. For the servants, however, the memory of a feast was not music or laughter but exhaustion. After hours of preparation, they spent the night scrubbing dishes, sweeping rushes soaked in spilled wine, and carting out the remains of the feast. Bones were thrown to dogs, trenchers distributed to the poor, and the hall restored to order for the next day's business. Few of the people who made the feast possible ever enjoyed its pleasures. Yet the feasting hall, for all its excess, was also a rare space of unity. In those moments, the castle's diverse inhabitants, from nobles to knights, clerks to cooks, were bound together in the shared ritual of eating. Even though hierarchy dictated who sat where and who ate what, the act itself reinforced the idea of the castle as a living community, each part essential to the whole. To modern eyes, the feasts of medieval castles may seem extravagant, bizarre, even grotesque. But to those who lived within these walls, they were essential. They fed bodies, yes, but they also fed reputations. A castle that could not host lavish meals was a castle whose power was in question. And as the last candles burned low and the hall returned to shadow, the echo of feasting gave way to another reality of castle life, one less glamorous, more dangerous, and often far more unpleasant. Beyond the smell of roasted meats lingered another, less pleasant odor, the realities of medieval health and hygiene. If the feasting hall dazzled with its spectacle of abundance, the latrines and sickrooms of a castle reminded everyone of the stark reality of medieval life. Behind the banners, beneath the stone walls, lurked an enemy more dangerous than any invading army: disease. And within the cramped spaces of a castle, it thrived. Contrary to modern romantic notions, medieval castles were not pristine palaces of chivalry and refinement. They were crowded, smoky, and often foul-smelling places where hygiene was a daily battle, and one often lost. The same walls that protected inhabitants from outside threats also trapped filth, odors, and germs inside. Imagine a fortress filled with dozens, sometimes hundreds of people: nobles, knights, cooks, servants, stable boys, and prisoners, all living in close quarters, sharing limited facilities, and relying on rudimentary sanitation. One of the most pressing concerns was waste disposal. Castles were equipped with garderobes, stone or wooden latrine chambers built along outer walls or over moats. These openings channeled human waste downward into cesspits or running water. From the outside, a garderobe might look like a small stone balcony protruding from the wall, but inside it was simply a bench with a hole. While functional, garderobes were hardly sanitary. Cesspits overflowed, and the stench could be unbearable. Worse still, they created structural vulnerabilities. Attackers sometimes used the shafts as entry points, and in times of siege, when waste disposal was limited, disease could spread rapidly. Bathing was equally complicated. Contrary to the myth that medieval people never bathed, many did, but not with the frequency or ease we expect today. Nobles might bathe in wooden tubs filled with heated water, scented with herbs like rosemary or lavender to mask unpleasant odors. Bathhouses existed in towns, but inside castles, bathing was sporadic, often reserved for special occasions. For ordinary servants, a quick rinse in cold water was sometimes the best they could manage. Daily cleanliness, in the modern sense, was unattainable. Hygiene wasn't just about bathing, it was about the environment. Castles were filled with smoke from open hearths and kitchens, which blackened walls and lungs alike. Animals were stabled within or just outside the walls, bringing with them fleas, lice, and manure. Rushes laid on floors to soften steps and absorb spills quickly became soaked with grease, food scraps, and vermin. A castle might look magnificent from afar, but step inside and you were assaulted by the smell of sweat, smoke, refuse, and damp stone. The lack of sanitation set the stage for disease, and when illness struck, the consequences were often catastrophic. The most infamous example was the Black Death of the 14th century, which swept across Europe with devastating speed. Castles, like villages and towns, were not spared. Rats and fleas carried plague into every corner of medieval society, and even the thickest castle walls offered no protection. In overcrowded conditions, the disease spread with ruthless efficiency. But plague was only one of many threats. Dysentery, known at the time as the bloody flux, was common, fueled by contaminated water and poor waste disposal. Tuberculosis, leprosy, and fevers of unknown origin haunted castle residents. Wounds from battle or daily labor often became infected, and with no concept of germ theory, even a small cut could prove fatal. Medical treatment was a mixture of practical remedies, religious rituals, and superstition. The castle's resident physician or barber surgeon relied on the ancient theories of humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, believing that illness came from imbalances. Treatments included bloodletting, purges, and herbal concoctions. Sometimes these remedies offered relief, often they did more harm than good. A sick noble might receive care in a chamber warmed by tapestries and attended by priests offering prayers. A sick servant, by contrast, was often left to endure illness with little more than basic herbs or the hope of survival. The fear of disease also shaped daily life in castles. Amulets, charms, and prayers were used as protection. Incense and strong-smelling herbs were burned to purify the air. During outbreaks, some castles closed their gates entirely, isolating themselves in an attempt to keep contagion out. Yet even isolation was not foolproof. Disease could arrive with a traveling merchant, a soldier returning from campaign, or even a beloved pet. Hygiene challenges also affected morale and discipline. Knights and soldiers confined within castle walls during sieges suffered from cramped quarters, spoiled food, and contaminated water. Accounts describe outbreaks of illness that decimated garrisons before enemy armies even breached the walls. For all their strength and fortification, castles could crumble from within under the invisible assault of disease. The psychological toll was immense. Death was a constant companion in the Middle Ages, and nowhere was this more visible than in the confined quarters of a castle. Families mourned children lost to fevers, servants quietly disappeared after succumbing to infection, and even lords and ladies faced the terrifying reality that no wealth or power could guarantee health. The sight of processions carrying bodies to burial grounds was a grim reminder that mortality lurked behind even the grandest stone walls. Yet, for all the horrors, people adapted. Servants learned to keep rushes fresher by replacing them with aromatic herbs. Water was boiled or flavored with wine to make it safer to drink. Herbal knowledge grew, and over generations, certain plants like garlic, sage, and thyme became trusted allies against sickness. And though primitive by today's standards, these measures offered a degree of resilience. When we picture the splendor of medieval banquets or the grandeur of armored knights, it is easy to forget this side of castle life. But to truly understand what it meant to live inside a medieval fortress, we must confront the reality that every day was shadowed by filth, foul air, and the lurking presence of disease. Life inside a castle was not just about power and pageantry, it was also about endurance in the face of discomfort and danger. And as we leave behind the dim corridors of garderobes and sickrooms, the story of castle life leads us to another defining aspect of survival, the daily rhythms of work and duty. For while disease haunted the castle, life had to go on. Knights trained, servants labored, and routines defined the heartbeat of the fortress. Behind the high stone walls, daily life in a medieval castle was a blend of discipline, duty, and routine. While visitors might have been dazzled by feasts and tournaments, the true reality of castle living was not constant excitement, it was work. From sunrise to sunset, every inhabitant, from the lowliest scullion to the lord himself, had a role to play in keeping the fortress alive and functioning. Castles were not museums of stillness, they were living, breathing machines of medieval society, and their rhythm was set by labor. The day began early. As the first light of dawn crept through narrow arrow slits, servants were already awake. The steward, one of the most important officers in the castle, oversaw the day's operations. He was responsible for managing supplies, organizing the workforce, and ensuring that every task, from preparing meals to maintaining defenses, was carried out. Under him, a hierarchy of servants and officials handled specific duties. The chamberlain cared for the lord's private quarters, the constable supervised the garrison of soldiers, and the marshal oversaw horses and stables. Every role mattered. For the majority of castle residents, work was physical and relentless. Kitchen servants stoked fires, kneaded bread, and hauled water from wells or nearby rivers. Stable boys mucked out stalls, brushed horses, and repaired tack. Laundry workers boiled clothes in huge cauldrons, scrubbing until their hands were raw. The smith hammered metal into tools, nails, or weapons, while carpenters repaired furniture, wagons, and the castle's wooden defenses. Even young children had chores, running errands, carrying messages, or tending to livestock. Life in a castle was not a life of leisure for most, it was a life of constant service. Knights and men-at-arms had their own routines. Contrary to romantic depictions of knights endlessly charging into battle, much of their time was spent training and maintaining readiness. The castle yard rang with the clash of wooden practice swords, the thud of lances against shields, and the barking commands of instructors. Squires, young men in training to become knights, polished armor, cared for horses, and absorbed lessons in discipline, etiquette, and strategy. These drills were not only preparation for war, they were daily reminders that a castle was first and foremost a military stronghold. For the lord and lady of the castle, daily life involved both governance and symbolism. The lord held court, listening to petitions from peasants, settling disputes among tenants, and managing the estate's finances. He was expected to be both warrior and administrator, ready to defend his lands yet also capable of running them effectively. The lady, meanwhile, had significant responsibilities of her own. She supervised domestic affairs, managed servants, oversaw food stores, and ensured that the household ran smoothly in her husband's absence. In times of war, some ladies even took command of the castle's defense, proving themselves formidable leaders. Religious observance was woven into the rhythm of each day. Many castles had private chapels where residents gathered for morning prayers, masses, and evening devotions. Monks or priests served as spiritual guides, while the ringing of bells marked the hours. Faith shaped not only the daily schedule but also the moral framework of castle life, reminding all who lived there that their worldly duties were tied to a higher order. Beyond religious devotion, leisure and entertainment punctuated the workday, though such moments were unevenly distributed. Nobles enjoyed music, poetry, and hunting expeditions in the surrounding forests. Falconry, a favored pastime, required immense patience and skill, symbolizing both status and refinement. For the lower ranks, leisure was rarer and simpler, a shared story by the fire, a game of dice, or a stolen hour of rest after long labor. Even laughter and play carried weight, for they provided relief in a life otherwise dominated by duty. Life in a castle was also deeply seasonal. In summer, days stretched long, filled with agricultural tasks, construction, and outdoor training. In winter, life contracted inward. Fires roared in the great hall, work slowed, and supplies were rationed carefully. Cold seeped through the stone walls, making warmth and food more precious than ever. Servants patched clothing, soldiers sharpened weapons, and nobles passed the time with games, reading, or religious study. The wheel of the year dictated the rhythm of the castle as surely as any clock. At the heart of this daily life was hierarchy. Social rank determined not only duties but also living conditions. Nobles slept in private chambers hung with tapestries, warmed by braziers, and furnished with beds of wool or feather. Servants, by contrast, often slept in shared quarters, sometimes on straw pallets near the kitchens or stables. Meals were similarly stratified. The lord dined on delicacies in the great hall, while servants ate simpler fare at separate tables or after their masters had finished. Every corner of the castle reinforced these divisions, ensuring that order was maintained. Yet despite these differences, the castle functioned as a community. Each person's work, no matter how humble, contributed to the survival of the whole. The mason who repaired a crumbling wall, the cook who prepared a soldier's stew, the boy who fetched water for the kitchens, all were part of the same living organism. A castle could not endure without the combined efforts of every individual inside. It is easy to imagine medieval castles only as stages for dramatic battles, sieges, and political intrigues. But those moments of high drama were rare compared to the daily grind of work and duty. For the people who actually lived there, life was not a fairy tale, it was a cycle of labor, devotion, hierarchy, and resilience. And that cycle created the foundation upon which the legends of castles were built. As the sun set and the day's work ended, torches flickered in corridors, and the castle prepared for night. Servants collapsed into exhausted sleep, guards took up positions on the walls, and the lord and lady retreated to their chambers. Tomorrow would bring the same rhythm of toil and responsibility, the same demands of survival within stone walls. But the story of castle life is not complete without looking beyond its gates. For castles were not isolated worlds unto themselves, they were the centers of vast estates, drawing in the labor and loyalty of peasants in the surrounding countryside. To understand the true power of a castle, we must leave the inner courtyard and step into the sprawling lands beyond, where villagers toiled under the shadow of the fortress. A medieval castle was never an isolated island of stone. Its true power extended far beyond its walls, stretching into the fields, farms, and villages that surrounded it. To understand what life was really like inside a castle, we must also look outward, because the rhythms of castle life were inseparably tied to the land and the people who worked it. Without the surrounding economy, the castle could not survive. At the heart of this relationship was the feudal system. The lord of the castle was not merely a military commander, he was also a landlord, overseeing vast estates populated by peasants and serfs. These villagers, bound by duty and tradition, worked the fields in exchange for protection. Their labor provided the grain, vegetables, livestock, and taxes that sustained the castle's inhabitants. It was a system built on obligation. The peasant gave his sweat, the lord gave his shield. Each village nestled near a castle functioned as a hive of activity. Thatched roof cottages dotted the landscape, their smoke curling into the sky. Fields of barley, oats, and wheat stretched outward, divided by hedgerows and dirt tracks. Livestock grazed in common pastures, sheep for wool, cows for milk, and pigs for meat. For villagers, the cycle of the seasons was everything. Spring meant planting, summer brought harvest labor, autumn required storing grain and preserving food, and winter was a time of scarcity, when survival depended on what had been laid by. The castle was both benefactor and burden. On one hand, it provided security. When raiders swept through the countryside or rival lords threatened violence, peasants could flee behind its walls, seeking refuge within the fortress. On the other hand, the castle demanded much in return. Taxes were levied in kind, a portion of harvested grain, a number of chickens, or a share of wool. Labor, too, was often required. Villagers might be called upon to repair castle walls, transport goods, or provide manpower during times of war. The castle's strength came directly from the backs of those who lived in its shadow. Markets and trade bound castle and village together. Weekly markets sprang up at the castle gates, where peasants sold surplus produce and craftsmen offered goods. Blacksmiths displayed tools and horseshoes, potters sold sturdy earthenware, and weavers brought lengths of cloth. Traveling merchants added spice to the scene, bringing salt, wine, or rare fabrics from distant lands. These markets were not only economic hubs but also social ones. News, gossip, and stories flowed as freely as the ale. In many ways, the market square was as vital to medieval life as the great hall was inside the castle. The economy of a castle was not just about survival, it was about status. A wealthy lord demonstrated his power through the prosperity of his lands. Well-fed soldiers, stocked granaries, and flourishing villages were outward signs of strength. Conversely, neglected lands or overburdened peasants spelled weakness, and rival lords would notice. The castle's treasury depended on rents, taxes, and tolls, which in turn fueled its ability to host feasts, fund armies, and build fortifications. Every stone added to a castle wall was, ultimately, paid for by the labor of villagers. For peasants, life was harsh. Most were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked. They could not leave without the lord's permission and owed him a portion of nearly everything they produced. Their days were filled with backbreaking toil, plowing, sowing, reaping, gathering firewood, tending animals. Children worked alongside parents from an early age, while women not only labored in the fields but also managed households, cooked, spun wool, and raised children. Illness, poor harvests, or harsh winters could bring devastation, and for many, hunger was a familiar companion. Yet despite the hardships, village life was not devoid of community and resilience. Festivals punctuated the year, harvest celebrations, religious feast days, and seasonal fairs provided moments of joy. The church, usually standing near the village, offered not only spiritual guidance but also a place for gathering. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals marked the passage of life, binding the community together. Laughter and music echoed during festivals, where even the poorest might dance, sing, and briefly escape the burdens of labor. The castle relied heavily on this community, but the relationship was double-edged. While lords offered protection, some were exploitative, demanding high rents or imposing harsh justice. Rebellions, though rare, did occur. Discontented peasants occasionally rose up against their lords, especially in times of famine or war. The bonds between castle and village were strong, but they were not unbreakable. Economically, castles also influenced wider trade networks. Positioned along rivers, roads, or trade routes, many lords collected tolls from merchants passing through their lands. Bridges, gates, and even castle roads became opportunities for income. This gave castles a dual role, military strongholds and economic choke points. To control a castle was often to control the wealth of an entire region. Daily interactions between villagers and castle inhabitants were constant. Peasants delivered food to the castle kitchens, provided firewood for its hearths, and mended its equipment. In return, they might receive leftover trenchers from feasts, protection during raids, or permission to gather wood from the lord's forests. These exchanges reinforced the visible and invisible ties binding the community together. From the lord's perspective, the village was his lifeline. A castle without productive peasants was a hollow shell, incapable of sustaining itself. The flow of grain into the granaries, wool into storerooms, and taxes into coffers ensured that the castle could function not just in times of peace but also during the inevitable storms of war. Seen in this light, the castle was not simply a fortress of stone, it was the center of an entire economic ecosystem. Its walls symbolized authority, but its true power radiated outward through the labor of peasants, the hum of markets, and the cycle of fields and farms. Without the surrounding village, the great halls would fall silent, kitchens would go cold, and soldiers would be left unfed. The might of the castle was inseparable from the soil beneath it. As the sun set over the fields and smoke rose from village chimneys, the castle loomed in the distance, a constant reminder of both protection and power. For the peasants, it was both guardian and master. For the lord, it was both treasure chest and stronghold. And together, they formed the intertwined world of medieval life, where survival depended on cooperation, labor, and loyalty. But survival was never guaranteed. In times of peace, this delicate balance held firm. In times of war, however, the castle became more than a landlord, it became the ultimate refuge and battlefield. And that brings us to one of the most dramatic chapters of castle life, the reality of sieges and warfare. For all the routines of daily life, all the feasts and festivals, all the rhythms of labor and faith, there was one reality that loomed over every medieval castle: war. Castles were not merely grand residences or symbols of prestige, they were fortresses built for conflict. And nothing tested a castle, or the people inside it, more than a siege. A siege was a brutal chess match played with human lives, patience, and endurance. Unlike open-field battles, where knights clashed in hours of bloody combat, sieges could last weeks, months, even years. They were wars of attrition, designed to starve defenders into submission, cut off supplies, and slowly grind down morale. For those trapped inside the walls, it was a test of both body and spirit. The preparations for such a crisis began long before an enemy appeared. Every castle was designed with defense in mind. High curtain walls loomed over ditches or moats, their surfaces deliberately smoothed to prevent climbing. Towers projected outward to give defenders clear fields of fire. Gatehouses were fortified with portcullises, murder holes, and heavy wooden doors bound with iron. Even the simplest architectural choices had one purpose: to make every step of an attacker's advance a nightmare. When word spread that an enemy army was approaching, life inside the castle changed instantly. Farmers drove livestock within the walls, carts of grain and barrels of ale were hauled into storerooms, and villagers crowded into cramped chambers. The castle, once a seat of authority, transformed into a crowded refuge. Guards doubled their watch, soldiers strapped on armor, and the lord called upon every oath-bound vassal to stand ready. For defenders, the first weapon was distance. Archers lined the walls, their arrows raining down on advancing troops. Stones were hurled from catapults, and boiling water, or in some cases, quicklime, was poured through murder holes onto attackers below. Crossbowmen, though slower to fire than longbowmen, delivered bolts with terrifying force, capable of piercing armor at close range. Every inch of wall became a stage for deadly defense. For attackers, ingenuity was key. Siege warfare evolved into a contest of technology as much as courage. Battering rams, sheathed in protective wooden tortoises, smashed against gates. Siege towers, taller than the walls themselves, rolled forward on creaking wheels, packed with soldiers ready to storm the battlements. Catapults and trebuchets hurled boulders, dead animals, and even burning pitch over the walls, spreading fire and disease. The most feared tactic of all was mining, digging tunnels beneath the castle foundations, then collapsing them to bring entire walls crashing down. But while weapons clashed outside, the real struggle inside was often hunger. A well-prepared castle could withstand months of siege, but supplies were finite. Grain dwindled, meat spoiled, water grew foul. Nobles dined on dwindling stores while servants survived on thin pottage. When food ran out, desperation set in. Chroniclers tell of defenders reduced to boiling leather, eating dogs and rats, even resorting to cannibalism in the most desperate sieges. The stone walls might hold, but human endurance was fragile. Disease was an even deadlier enemy. With villagers crammed inside, sanitation collapsed. Latrines overflowed, water sources became contaminated, and sickness spread rapidly. Dysentery, fevers, and plague often killed more defenders than enemy weapons. For the trapped population, every cough or fever was a reminder that death lurked not only outside the gates but also within. Psychological warfare was just as ruthless. Attackers catapulted the bodies of dead animals or plague victims over the walls to spread fear and infection. They lit fires at night, drums beating to keep defenders sleepless and demoralized. Defenders, in turn, sometimes displayed the bodies of captured enemies as grim warnings. A siege was not just a contest of weapons but a contest of willpower. Yet castles were built to endure, and some held out magnificently. At times, relief armies arrived, forcing attackers to retreat. At other times, sheer determination carried defenders through months of hardship until the besieging force gave up. Chronicles celebrate such moments as proof of the castle's strength and the lord's honor. But victories were rare. More often, hunger and exhaustion eventually forced surrender. When a castle finally fell, the consequences were brutal. If defenders resisted until the last, attackers often showed no mercy. Massacres of garrisons, looting, and burning of villages were common punishments meant to deter future resistance. Surrender terms, if negotiated early, could spare lives, but humiliation was still inevitable. The castle might be occupied, dismantled, or repurposed as a symbol of the victor's dominance. For those inside, surviving a siege was a life-altering experience. Nobles might lose their lands or be ransomed back after capture. Soldiers bore scars both physical and mental. Peasants returned to ruined homes, scorched fields, and empty storehouses. Siege warfare was not only about walls and weapons, it was about the devastation left behind. Yet, despite their horrors, sieges reinforced the castle's central role in medieval life. They demonstrated why such fortresses were built in the first place, not for comfort, not for beauty, but for survival. A castle under siege became the ultimate test of loyalty, courage, and endurance. It forced every inhabitant, lord, knight, servant, and peasant, to face the grim reality of war together. As Europe evolved, so too did the nature of siege warfare. The arrival of gunpowder in the late Middle Ages changed everything. Cannons, with their thunderous roars and destructive force, rendered high walls increasingly obsolete. No matter how thick or tall the stone, gunpowder artillery could eventually shatter it. The age of castles as impregnable fortresses slowly waned, giving way to new forms of fortification. Still, in their prime, castles were unmatched symbols of both defiance and fear. To stand atop the walls during a siege was to witness the raw struggle of medieval life distilled into its starkest form, survival against overwhelming odds. The castle was not just a home or a court, it was a battlefield in stone. And yet, even in times of peace, the shadow of war never left. Training, drills, and watchfulness defined daily routines because everyone knew that tomorrow could bring the sound of distant drums and the sight of enemy banners on the horizon. A castle was always waiting for its next test. Life inside a medieval castle was not only about survival, labor, or war. These fortresses were also centers of culture, entertainment, and symbolism, microcosms of the society they ruled. Beyond their defensive walls, castles were stages where art, music, spectacle, and ritual all came together to shape medieval identity. To begin, one must understand that every castle was more than stone, it was a symbol. The towering walls and lofty keeps were designed to awe. They broadcast power to friend and foe alike. A castle's silhouette rising above the landscape was as much a political message as it was a defensive structure. It said, "Here is authority. Here is wealth. Here is permanence." Peasants toiling in the fields saw not only a military stronghold but also a constant reminder of the lord's dominance over the land. For visiting nobles, the grandeur of a great hall or the sophistication of a chapel declared prestige and legitimacy. But within those same walls, culture flourished in ways that might surprise us. Medieval entertainment ranged from the humble to the magnificent. On quiet evenings, servants and household members might gather to tell folktales, sing simple ballads, or play board games like Nine Men's Morris or chess. For the noble classes, entertainment was grander. Troubadours and minstrels wandered from court to court, performing songs of chivalry, love, and heroic deeds. Their music echoed through stone halls, carrying tales that blended history and myth. Feasts, too, were spectacles of cultural life. More than just meals, they were opportunities to display wealth and status. Tables groaned under roasted meats, exotic spices, and sweet pastries. Jesters performed tricks and witty banter, acrobats astonished with impossible feats, and musicians filled the air with melodies. Feasts often included elaborate rituals, toasts to kings, recitations of heroic poetry, and displays of rare luxuries. For guests, attending a castle banquet was as much about being impressed as it was about eating. Hunting was another major pastime, especially among the nobility. To hunt boar or deer was not simply sport, it was practice for war, training knights in the arts of pursuit, discipline, and kill. It was also deeply symbolic. Falconry, in particular, became a status marker. To own a falcon was to display wealth and sophistication, for falcons were rare, expensive, and required meticulous training. In tapestries and manuscripts, lords and ladies are often shown with falcons perched proudly on their hands, embodying both nobility and mastery over nature. Tournaments brought entertainment to another level. Though often romanticized, these events were brutal and dangerous. Jousting, where armored knights charged at each other with lances, was the centerpiece spectacle. Crowds roared as warriors clashed, banners flew, and heralds announced noble lineages. Beyond combat, tournaments were also highly theatrical, filled with pageantry, music, and ritual. Victors gained honor, wealth, and admiration, while the defeated were sometimes left broken on the field. These tournaments reinforced ideals of chivalry, courage, and competition, the very values that underpinned medieval aristocracy. Religion, too, wove itself into the cultural fabric of castles. Chapels inside the walls hosted daily prayers, marriages, baptisms, and masses. Religious festivals brought moments of joy and solemnity alike. On holy days, even the grim battlements of a fortress might be decorated with banners and garlands, transforming cold stone into spaces of celebration. Christianity infused not only worship but also art. Stained glass windows, illuminated manuscripts, and carved statues inside castles reflected both devotion and artistry, reminding inhabitants of divine presence even in a fortress of war. Symbolism extended beyond art and architecture into rituals of power. The act of hosting guests, distributing gifts, or holding court were themselves forms of cultural performance. A lord seated in the high chair of a great hall, dispensing justice beneath the carved beams and tapestries of his ancestors, was not only ruling, he was embodying authority. Every gesture, every display of luxury, reinforced hierarchy. The castle was theater, and everyone within it played a role. Even leisure carried layers of meaning. Board games like chess were not mere diversions but metaphors for life and war. The movements of pawns and kings mirrored the structure of feudal society itself, teaching strategy and hierarchy. Storytelling, whether through minstrels or wandering poets, was not only entertainment but also education, instilling values of loyalty, honor, and bravery into every listener. For the lower classes living within the walls, cultural life was simpler but no less important. Folk songs carried local history, dances provided rare joy, and seasonal festivals gave rhythm to lives otherwise marked by labor. Though they lacked the luxury of noble feasts or tournaments, they too participated in the cultural heartbeat of the castle. For them, the castle was both prison and protector, oppressor and provider. Even their simplest forms of entertainment were tinged with that duality. As time passed, castles also became repositories of art and memory. Lords commissioned tapestries depicting great battles, genealogies, and biblical stories. These decorated walls served not only to warm drafty chambers but to remind all who entered of lineage and legacy. Castles were not static stone, they were living galleries of history and symbolism. In the end, culture and entertainment inside castles were never frivolous. They were tools of cohesion, distraction, and power. They reinforced hierarchy, provided relief from hardship, and gave meaning to existence within those thick walls. Every song, every feast, every ritual was a reminder. Life in a medieval castle was not only about endurance, but also about identity. When we think of castles today, we often picture their cold stones, their moats, and their looming towers. Yet, for those who lived inside, they were also places of music, laughter, rivalry, and faith. They were theaters of medieval life, where survival and spectacle walked hand in hand. For centuries, castles had stood as the ultimate symbols of strength, wealth, and authority. Their towers loomed over villages, their walls cast shadows across valleys, and their battlements defined medieval warfare. But nothing lasts forever. By the late Middle Ages, the age of castles was drawing to a close. The very structures that had once seemed invincible were rendered vulnerable by new inventions, shifting politics, and changing societies. The decline of castles was not sudden but gradual, a fading of relevance as the medieval world itself gave way to something new. The first and most decisive factor in this decline was technology, specifically, gunpowder. Arriving in Europe during the 13th and 14th centuries, it revolutionized warfare. Cannons, crude at first, quickly grew more powerful. By the 15th century, artillery could reduce stone walls to rubble in days, where once sieges had taken months or even years. No matter how thick the masonry, the thunderous force of cannonballs tore through defenses that had stood for generations. High curtain walls and tall towers, once symbols of strength, became liabilities, easy targets for explosive firepower. Castles tried to adapt. Some were reinforced with angled bastions, lower and thicker walls designed to deflect cannon fire. Moats were widened, gatehouses fortified. Yet these adaptations were costly, and even they struggled to match the growing sophistication of artillery. The design of fortresses shifted into a new style, star-shaped bastions, spread across wide areas, with low walls and sloping earthworks. These were not castles in the traditional sense but a new form of military architecture better suited for the gunpowder age. The second factor in the decline of castles was political centralization. In the early Middle Ages, castles were essential tools for lords and barons to assert dominance over their territories. They were strongholds of feudal power, enabling local rulers to resist or rebel against kings. But as monarchies grew stronger, this decentralized model of power weakened. Kings and centralized states no longer wanted private fortresses dotting the countryside. Some rulers even ordered the destruction, or slighting, of castles to prevent rebellious lords from using them as bases of resistance. England's monarchs, for example, after quelling revolts, often dismantled the castles of defeated nobles as both punishment and deterrent. The changing role of warfare also diminished the castle's importance. By the late medieval and early modern periods, battles were increasingly fought in open fields with large professional armies, rather than in prolonged sieges. Castles, once vital military hubs, were bypassed or ignored in favor of decisive campaigns. The resources needed to maintain a garrison and fortify a castle became harder to justify when warfare itself was shifting toward mobility and massed firepower. Economic changes accelerated the decline. The medieval economy had been agrarian, rooted in feudal dues and obligations. Castles fit perfectly into that world, as centers of both authority and protection. But as trade expanded, cities grew, and wealth shifted into mercantile hands, castles became less central. Merchants and burghers looked not to fortified towers but to town walls, guild halls, and marketplaces for protection and influence. Power was no longer measured solely in stone fortresses but in gold, trade routes, and fleets of ships. At the same time, culture itself was changing. The Renaissance brought new tastes, new art, and new expectations of comfort. Stone chambers, draughty halls, and dimly lit keeps were no longer enough for Europe's elites. Nobles and monarchs desired palaces, not fortresses. Architecture shifted toward elegance and display rather than pure defense. Windows grew larger, gardens more elaborate, interiors more richly decorated. Where castles had once embodied a fusion of war and domesticity, Renaissance palaces embodied luxury, prestige, and a new definition of power. For many castles, this meant a new lease on life, not as fortresses, but as residences or administrative centers. Some were transformed into stately homes, their defenses softened, their walls pierced with wide windows, their great halls turned into ballrooms. Others fell into ruin, abandoned when their military purpose vanished and their upkeep became too burdensome. Across Europe, once mighty strongholds were left to crumble, their stones quarried for local building projects, their moats filled in, their towers collapsing into ivy-covered relics. Yet even in decline, castles did not lose their symbolic weight. If anything, their ruins acquired new meanings. In the Romantic era of the 18th and 19th centuries, poets, painters, and travelers rediscovered them as haunting reminders of a vanished age. The crumbling walls and shattered towers stirred imaginations, evoking tales of knights, damsels, and heroic struggles. Artists like Caspar David Friedrich painted castles as ghostly silhouettes, symbols of nostalgia and mystery. What had once been engines of war became monuments of memory. In some regions, castles endured not through nostalgia but adaptation. Many were converted into administrative seats, prisons, or even tourist attractions. Others became heritage sites, meticulously preserved to showcase the medieval past. Kings and aristocrats, too, sometimes embraced castle imagery to reinforce their own claims to tradition. For example, the 19th century saw a revival of neo-Gothic architecture, with new castles built not for defense but for display, echoing the shapes and towers of the medieval past while hiding modern luxuries inside. But for the people of the Middle Ages who once crowded into these fortresses during times of siege or famine, the castle's decline was bittersweet. The end of castles meant the end of a way of life. The rhythms of feudal loyalty, the constant specter of siege, the harsh hierarchies of stone, all gave way to a different world. In their place rose cities, courts, and states that defined the modern era. Castles had been more than just buildings, they were the physical embodiment of medieval society. Their fall mirrored the end of that age itself. Today, when we walk among castle ruins or marvel at restored fortresses, we are not seeing just architecture. We are glimpsing the skeletons of an entire civilization. Their decline was inevitable, but their legacy endures. They remind us that even the mightiest symbols of human power are temporary. Stone crumbles, towers fall, and walls collapse, but the stories they carried live on. The fall of castles was not a tragedy, but a transformation. They did not vanish from memory, instead, they passed from practical necessity into myth, legend, and history. Once the backbone of medieval life, castles became echoes of the past, shaping how we imagine the Middle Ages even centuries after their military relevance had ended.